morning. My name is Adriana Morales, and I am the District Fisheries Biologist for U.S. Forest District. Thank you.
All right, Chris Leahy, you can go next.
Chris Leahy, I'm the Tillamook County Public Works Director.
All right, Dave Shively.
Hello, Dave Shively here with the Nestucca, Neskowin, and Sand Lake Watersheds Council.
York.
York Johnson with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality in a shared position with the Tillamook Estuary Partnership.
Aaliyah.
Malia Capillas, hydrogeologist with Pacific Hydrogeology. I also serve on the Nestucca, Neskowin, Sand Lake Watershed Council Board. I'm also the Tierra del Mar representative, and I've been on this project since the very beginning with everybody.
Great. Jason.
Morning, everybody. Jason Elkins. I'm the park manager at Cape Lookout Management Unit, which includes Sitka, Sedge State Natural Area. And I'm looking forward to the findings in your analysis.
Great. Trevor.
Hey everybody, Trevor Griffiths, also with OPRD, Natural Resource Specialist. Thanks.
Perfect. Cami.
Hi everybody, I'm Cami Ellingson. I'm the Watershed Program Manager for the Sitka National Forest.
Leah Tai.
She said she's going to be joining late.
That's right. Yeah, I saw that.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Well, she's with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Phipps. I'm the manager of the Oregon Coastal Management Program with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And has it really been 10 years, Noel?
Almost.
Oh my goodness.
Alrighty.
9. Let's round down. Let's not go.
Funny how long these projects take sometimes.
Did I miss anyone? Perfect. I will let Hunter take it away then.
Okay, thanks, Conrad. Well, I'm going to be covering a lot of ground today, and we'll be moving through some of this pretty quickly. So if you do need clarification in the moment, do feel free to speak up or raise your hand. We'll have a number of pauses along the way to kind of slow down after each major topic and have some room for discussion in those areas. I'm going to give a quick overview for those who may be new to the project, but assuming that most of you do have some background here. I'll be presenting the results of our alternatives analysis and 2D modeling effort. The main categories that we'll be walking through are the dike breach configuration and how to accommodate or maintain the trail under each of those scenarios. The meat of the presentation here is going to be around the location of the setback dike, how it would perform hydraulically speaking under each of the locations we've looked at, some other logistical considerations, and the fact that the locations we're talking about are in areas of existing heavy beaver activity and what that would mean for maintenance as well as potential functionality in that location, in that setting. We'll be covering along the way other aspects of these alternatives as well, ecological uplift and impact associated with these alternatives, how they affect recreation at the park, how they tie in and affect other infrastructure such as Sand Lake Road, and some rough concept level construction costs for a basis of comparison. We've also performed a fairly detailed assessment of Tierra del Mar's drainage system, mostly to understand flow inputs for our hydraulic model, but also looking more broadly at Tierra del Mar and some of the flooding and drainage issues that residents experience, and really to show how some of those are related to Sitka sedge, and how really a lot of the drainage issues further south in Tierra del Mar are not related to restoration, but want to kind of look at this as a comprehensive project planning effort. So like I said, I'll be going through this pretty quickly. Again, let me know if you have questions, and otherwise we'll have some pause moments to discuss. So this is the location of Sitka Sedge here on the south end of Sand Lake, near Tierra del Mar, for those who may not be as familiar. Belts Dyke on the north end of the park separates Belts Marsh from Sand Lake. The purpose of this project is really around the fact that the existing culvert and tide gate and dike are failing. The culvert, there once was a tide gate on this 4x4 concrete box culvert. The tide gate is completely missing now. There's also significant erosions, mostly around the culvert itself, but in some other locations. So essentially, if nothing were done here, the dike and culvert structure will eventually fail. So this project is really to come at this in a planned manner and have a controlled breach rather than an inadvertent breach that we're not prepared for. We also want to provide fish passage into Reneke Creek, Belts Creek, and No Name Creeks, as well as the marsh area behind the dike, the existing dike. And currently the existing dike has low points that are only barely above current king tides, and they'll soon be at risk of overtopping with any amount of sea level rise. We have previously studied at a high level some of these alternatives. So the no action alternative of letting the tide gate deteriorate on its own, breaching the dike. We've looked at a modern tide gate system, and then coming around to looking at a dike breach scenario with a setback dike in place. The real purpose of this phase of work has been to advance the level of modeling that was used. Previously, we were using a hydrologic budget model, or known as the bucket model. We've developed a 2D hydrodynamic model using HECRAS, and really we're looking to refine the locations and details of these key elements, namely the dike breach and the setback dike location. We'll also be looking at additional potential site enhancements, such as tidal channel creation, filling some of the ditches, vegetation enhancements, and then noting that Sand Lake Road has 3 culverts at Reneke, Belts, and No Name Creek that will ultimately be replaced as well, but that's not directly a part of this study right now. And as I said, we looked at Tierra del Mar's drainage system, really as a look at how we input those flows to the model, as well as identifying some potential improvements that could be undertaken in the future. Zooming out here on our concept plan, and we'll kind of be stepping through the presentation in this manner. So really first looking at the dike breach locations and how to maintain the Belts Dike Trail, or the connection out to the rest of the trail network. And again, looking at different locations for setback dike improvement at the south end of the marsh. I'm going to go ahead and share some of the conclusions here up front. Again, we've got a lot to kind of talk through, but wanted to kind of give some of these summaries up front so you all can start thinking about those and really just not bury the conclusion here. So what we've looked at out here on the outer dike is we've looked at a 100-foot wide breach at the top, a 200-foot wide breach, and then full dike removal. Really looking at a range of different ways to reconnect the marsh. But noting that each one of these breach configurations needs some accommodation to maintain the trail. The Belts Dike Trail is currently connected to the existing trailhead and parking lot and provides access out to the whole rest of the trail network. So these two 100-foot and 200-foot breach options could feasibly be spanned by a pedestrian bridge and really just leave the dike trail where it is. But full dike removal would require what we're calling replacing the trail with a roughly 2,000-foot boardwalk. That would be the most natural and most natural way to reconnect the marsh, to remove the artificial fill feature that has been placed. But it would be significantly more expensive, both in the excavation of the dike as well as the boardwalk would be massive cost. And it's really unclear, one reason we were considering full removal is understanding how sediment dynamics would be affected and the potential for marsh accretion in the future for marsh accumulation to keep pace with sea level rise. But it's really unclear whether full dike removal would benefit sediment accretion, which I'll get into a little bit more. But the punchline here is really that we're looking at likely the smaller breach is effective at equalizing water levels and keeping velocities through the breach fairly low, and can be more effectively spanned by a pedestrian bridge. So we'll talk through some of the boardwalk, some of the analysis that we did around that, as well as looking at boardwalk options and costs associated with that. But this is where I'm thinking we end up. We'll also get into some of the other improvements along the dike that would need to be made if this is maintained as the trail long into the future. For the setback dike locations, we've looked at 4 different options for setback dike locations. What was considered in the previous phase and has loosely been described as the setback dike location is what we're showing as alternative 1. It's roughly where the existing beaver dam is. This could be immediately downstream, immediately upstream, or literally right over the dam, essentially replacing the main beaver dam. We've looked at 2 other alternatives that push the setback dike further south into the marsh. And the real goal of this study has been to try to see if we could push the dike further south to reduce the amount of direct wetland impact with the footprint of the dike, as well as reducing the amount of wetland left behind the dike, behind the setback dike in these configurations. We also looked at the potential of pushing the setback dike all the way back to Sand Lake Road. So raising Sand Lake Road and Roma Ave as the setback dike, which essentially effectively becomes a non-setback dike alternative that just raises the roads and potentially private property up above the tide levels. This is essentially a baseline comparison and really the first step of just breaching the dike and showing what would happen there, and then applying each of these setback dikes to limit tidal inundation, as well as make sure that there's enough storage behind the setback dike to contain all of the stormwater that will flow in during the 100-year storm that we've developed. And, again, kind of jumping to some of the conclusions around what we found for the setback dike locations, comparing it to existing conditions, first of all. So just understanding how the existing conditions function and how the existing dike is functioning right now. Because there is no tide gate left, water does flow through the existing culvert. It is a constriction both on incoming flows and outgoing flows. So during high tides out in Sand Lake, the existing dike and small culvert limit tides by about 1.5 feet compared to what Sand Lake is seeing. And I'll show you a little bit of a comparison later. This is about 0.5 foot higher than the water levels we were seeing back in 2017 when there was some of the tide gate was left. Now with no tide gate at all, water is rising about 0.5 foot higher than it was in 2017. Again, the existing culvert impedes flow in and out, and it really impedes drainage and causes prolonged high water levels that stack up in the marsh and take many days to drain out. But the real benefit that the existing, again, the benefit that the existing dike does provide right now is when there's not a storm, not a lot of rainfall coming in, the dike does limit high tides by about 1.5 feet. And also very important to note, in the existing conditions, the existing beaver dams, they're a main dam, but a number of dams throughout the marsh, essentially maintain water levels at the south end of the marsh at about 8 feet. So there's really no potential for water to drain any lower than that during these storm event that we modeled. So as far as the different locations we've looked at, it is really alternative 1, the setback dike near the existing beaver dam that does have enough storage to contain the 100-year storm and really improve performance over the existing dike. Alternatives 2 and 3, where we tried to push the dike further to the south, they can prevent high tides, but they do get overwhelmed during the large storms, particularly when we look at the 100-year storm. And then alternative 4, 4A and 4B, essentially raising the road up. It allows full unrestrained high tides to reach the south end of the marsh and is essentially raising up the infrastructure to accommodate that. It does drain out a lot faster than existing conditions, but the higher daily tides would occur. The other big thing I want to get into here today is, you know, what we're showing for the modeling of these alternatives and the hydraulic performance is assuming that the culverts stay clear, that, you know, everything stays well maintained, functional, and flowing. But the location we're talking about putting the setback dike is right near either upstream or downstream of heavy beaver activity. And so I'm going to show a few examples of other locations that are dealing with this, as well as some potential mitigation measures that can be implemented to reduce the impact of beavers and how they will affect a new tide gate, new structure, and get into some of the discussion about, you know, what we can do about it, what are the implications for maintenance, and what are the implications for long-term performance of a setback dike, new culvert, and tide gate in this location. So that I could kind of stop there, and that's, you know, partly, again, shared a lot of the conclusions there that I'm going to be diving into in a lot more detail now. So I will go ahead and pause right now for just any initial comments or thoughts as I get into this, or even, you know, particular questions that you want to see answered moving through. Hey, York.
Hey, so I saw, and hopefully I got this correctly, you talk about the breach of the dike and then the removal of the existing culvert. But then it seemed like in your infographic there, you were calling for reconstructing the levee. And I was wondering if you're considering, you know, you talk about limiting impacts on wetland fill. Have you considered, you know, obviously it's going to cost more for a bridge, but 2 bridges, and, you know, if you're going to remove fill from a wetland, why would you put it back unnecessarily other than cost? Just a comment.
Yeah, yep. And I'll get into what we looked at for single dike breach versus multiple breaches, and that kind of gets at your question there, York. You know, one quick answer to that is, with multiple breaches, it will be much less predictable. You know, so if we, for example, we think we need a 200-foot breach, and we split that into 2 100-foot breaches with a 100-foot bridge over each one, we think that there's certainly risk that one of those would silt in, one would become the preferential flow path and enlarge itself and cause scour and erosion. So I think we're ending up recommending that it is a single breach, really, for the predictability of how the system performs in the future. And then also, I'll get into this as well, that the existing location of the culvert is not really aligned with the historical channels. And so if we do go with one breach, we do think it makes sense to put it aligned with the primary historical channels. But good points, and we can certainly talk about that more as well. Hey, Cammie.
Hey, Hunter. I have a broader, maybe a project goal question. So having been involved in this clear back when I was a hydrologist out of Hebo, so, you know, many years ago, the acquisition when OWEB was funding the acquisition by state parks, my understanding is that the goal was to restore the full title processes as much as possible. And I'm wondering if the boardwalk or continued public access is potentially getting in the way of that. I'm curious about access walking across to the trail network from the setback. I understand the parking issue, but I'm overall, I'm asking about the ultimate goal here of restoration versus public access, I guess. And maybe that's not a question for you necessarily. I guess I just want to give some of that context, having been involved with some of the early work to help get public dollars to fund this acquisition with the specific target of restoring the natural processes to the best of our ability.
Yeah, certainly a great discussion, and like you said, not all in my court to respond to, and certainly happy to facilitate and have that discussion. You know, just quickly, as far as, you know, if we end up with the setback dike near the Beaver Dam or south into the marsh, you know, there are potential trail options here. Certainly not easy, and as you noted, that, you know, the parking lot is further up to the north where the main trailhead focus area is. You know, we have looked at potential for a boardwalk that would cross the Reneke Creek area. You know, I don't know if you or many of you have walked through this area now, but to cross Belts Creek area is pretty challenging. We would certainly be talking about more of a boardwalk connection out to this location of the setback dike. On the west side, it maybe is easier to connect to the existing trail network there. But the east side, where we're talking about tying in to Sand Lake Road in one of these two locations or somewhere in between, you know, there's really not great pedestrian access to the east end of what we're proposing without some pretty substantial trail work along this eastern edge and the crossing Reneke and Belts Creek areas.
I would imagine, though, if there was a bit of a financial analysis looking at improved access on this south end versus spanning, you know, ever wider breaches, because you don't know how the tide's going to work on those breaches. I mean, any increased velocity in a system like this is going to result in scour at a nick point, a hydrologic nick point, and it is going to alter the sediment depositional pattern, which again, and you know, as you mentioned, with the effort to try to restore the natural processes as much as possible, you don't want to be introducing ways that you're fighting nature unnecessarily. And I just throw that out because I wonder if you were to really break down the costs of each and try to project the future as best we can to really look at the impacts that may occur and the unintended consequences. Just something to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, I don't know if anybody else does want to speak to that or add on to that. You know, I think, Cami, essentially what we're looking at as, you know, kind of jumping through some of these slides, you know, this being more of a configuration that would look at fully removing the dike and, you know, removing that berm, that levee that had been built in this location in the past, and fully reconnecting the marsh to Sand Lake. And, you know, we're showing this as a potential boardwalk location, kind of pushing the boardwalk south, you know, running through the Reneke Creek forested area and crossing the marsh, which requires, again, about 2,000 feet of boardwalk in this location, plus these bridges that would have to span channels that, you know, as you're noting, could evolve over time as well. So there is some unpredictable nature of how, you know, these channels and things might evolve. And yeah, I'll get into some of this a little bit more in detail as I step through this particular question. But our goal and directive at this point has really been to maintain trail connectivity, that this, you know, this is a very extensive trail network on the west side of the park, and this currently is our trailhead connection. And so, you know, is there a way to run a trail or a, you know, combination of trails and boardwalks further south, connecting with the setback dike and leave this northern end of the marsh more unrestrained? Yes, there certainly is, and that's likely, you know, an even higher cost than some of what we'll present here in just a few moments. But yeah, anybody else want to respond or address any of that topic?
I would say that from the state parks perspective, that there's still a lot of thinking to do on this. This is sort of the first reveal of this set of alternatives, and we haven't discussed this in detail. So it's still a work in progress.
Yeah, and to that point, want to have this discussion today to kind of present what we've come up with and have these sorts of questions and discussions. And I don't think anybody's pushing to make firm decisions today or in the coming days, and really wanted to have this discussion to have some of these questions asked and get some of these topics in folks' mind for these sorts of conversations. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Chris Knudsen.
Yeah, so when you talk about bridges over the existing dike, like 100-foot bridges, are these free spanning, or do they have center supports, or what kind of vision do you have for that?
Yeah, we would be looking at clear span bridges, and I'll again get into kind of the dimensions that we looked at, but up to about 150-foot pedestrian bridge, free span pedestrian bridge is pretty reasonable. This one at the top here is a Contec connector truss, I believe it's called, and they can be free span up to 150 feet with vehicular loading, and that's another kind of detail to work out as we move forward with any sort of pedestrian bridge or boardwalk design. Is what we've been planning for so far is at least the ability to get a pickup truck out across it. But yeah, so 150-foot clear span is reasonable. Larger spans are possible, but less, start to get a lot more expensive. But yes, Chris, we'd be looking at free span over these bridges.
And as far as the boardwalk goes, how many, what's the spacing of pilings and all that other material that would have to be placed in the wetland there?
Yeah, we've got, just some working assumptions right now around, what kind of unit costs for boardwalk. But if we were to select boardwalk as a preferred path forward or one for more investigation, we would be getting additional geotechnical data and getting into more of a design about type of foundation, spacing, et cetera. That's another aspect of this boardwalk would need to be fairly tall to cross this marsh and be above high tides. And so that's another consideration. We have looked at the Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge boardwalk as an example that would be fairly similar here. I don't know if y'all know this structure. It's an amazing experience to walk out across this boardwalk. It is a really nice park feature, but very expensive. Even back almost 15 years ago now, it was nearly $3 million for this boardwalk, and they've had some trouble with it. They've had some issues with channels enlarging and needing to replace the main bridge that they put in. So a boardwalk also comes with long-term maintenance questions and considerations. There are other options of concrete boardwalk essentially, which would have less maintenance in the future, but really a higher upfront cost. And so the costs become quite substantial to replace the half-a-mile trail that we have with a boardwalk.
Yeah, thanks. That was really helpful, and kudos to you for having pictures at hand and know where to find them to show us. That's pretty good. Yeah, just 2 cents here. I'm just looking at this boardwalk going, man, I'm not a fan at all of running a boardwalk through the center of that marsh right there, but we can talk through it.
Right. Yeah, any other questions right up front? Oh, hey, Jason.
Hey there. I just thought I'd speak briefly to the recreational aspect of Sitka Sedge and everything, and Oregon Parks and Recreation in general. Obviously, we have recreation in the title of our agency's name, so it's an important aspect of our work, as is the restoration and everything. And with the Belts Dyke Trail, just wanted to speak a little bit about the accessibility for our visitors to get out and experience, the estuary or marshland. I think that's definitely an important consideration long-term, determining the access, where that will remain within the park and everything. And some interesting proposals out there for the recreation and the boardwalk. Does scare me a little bit with maintenance long-term, but yeah, interested to see what we all come up with.
Great. So I'll start moving through some of this. I'm not keeping a good eye on the chat. Okay. I see nothing too pressing there. Conrad or others, if you see anything in the chat, feel free to highlight it. Okay. So as far as
I just want to weigh in really
Chris.
quick. I just want to weigh in really quick. I really don't like the boardwalk concept. The free spanning bridges are, I think, a great idea, and a lot of comment on those deal with saltwater. They make it with core 10, which is basically already rusted and serves as a barrier for salt. So I do like the free spanning bridge, and I really don't like the boardwalk concept.
Great, thanks, Chris. And yeah, we'll again, as we select a general alternative moving forward, we'll drill into a lot of the details of material choices and lifespan, longevity, maintenance implications, and so forth. A couple more questions. We've got York.
Yeah, I noticed, just looking at what we've talked about, if you want to say the northwest end of the levee system, it seems like it takes a kind of a long way around to get your trail system. Have you looked at a shorter distance to access the trail network? And that would seem like it might be a compromise between full levee removal and maintaining the levee for stability and what everyone's talking about. So that was one question. But then I also do want to reiterate Cammie's point that there's a lot of things to take into consideration, definitely recreation, definitely cost, but then the ultimate goal of this funding was to maximize the restoration for salmonids, and I think we should definitely always keep that front and center when we're making these decisions and having discussions. So thanks.
Thanks, York. Malia, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. Following up on what York just said, now that the beavers have changed things significantly from a hydrogeologic perspective, and the dike or the tide gate has failed more, so we've got more water coming in. Have we done any water temperature monitoring or anything or checking to see if maybe these natural changes in how the system is responding is actually more favorable to fish? I mean, granted, we still have a fish passage issue through the tide gate, but I mean, is the system working better from a temperature perspective? That's my question, because I think that could be a factor that we want to take into consideration. In other words, what's our current conditions?
So
York, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. We haven't done any additional monitoring since the original work, and I think we did some follow-up in 2019. I think was the last time we did any water quality monitoring work. So I'm not sure how the changes relate to that time frame. It sounds like the changes to the flow has been relatively recent, like since 2019. So that's the short answer, is we haven't done any additional work since 2019, but still one of the drivers to poor water quality is this restriction. So while there's less of a restriction, this is still a pretty significant restriction. I think Hunter mentioned, that there's a lot of backup in water behind this levee still, and that's really, what can drive poor water quality conditions. So there might be minor improvement, but generally, when you see systems like this that are so impacted by restrictions in flow, generally the water quality remains poor until you kind of meet that critical mass of water exchange. Sorry, I don't have a better answer at this point based on data.
That's okay, York. I'm just curious, could we get some temperature gauges out there strategically and, short term for a month or something?
That's possible. Most of our loggers were working on ocean acidification monitoring in Tillamook Bay, but that project has ended, so there is more opportunity to do this type of work forward.
I'd love to work with
Yeah.
you on that, York.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, back in 2019, 2017 even, the tide gate was already partially missing. And so there was a fair amount of water pushing through. It has been since then, I don't know when it occurred, but likely in, 2021 or 22, that the tide gate has fully gone missing. And so again, it is letting in a little bit more water, about a half a foot higher water levels on a daily basis. But still not to the point where the daily tides are overtopping the Beaver Dam. And I did take a look at York's tech team presentation from a few years ago, where was kind of describing that the area upstream of the Beaver Dam is fairly isolated because of how high it is, the dam being at about 8 feet, and really does maintain that area behind it as fresh water. Whereas downstream, immediately downstream of the Beaver Dam, we do get these pulses of salinity and really changes in temperature through the tide cycle as water moves through. But that, again, south of the Beaver Dam, it's fairly isolated. Even now, that would change under a full reconnection option, and the setback dike, depending on its location, potentially preserves that area behind the Beaver Dam essentially as status quo as it currently is. So yeah, I guess if no other immediate comments, I'll kind of start diving in more detail here, and yeah, I think great questions already. Great comments. So start with the dike breach location and size and these factors that we've already started to talk a little bit about, and how to maintain the trail. We start by looking at, where it makes sense, or where could we make these connections. And so really looking at, essentially 4 different locations. The existing culvert and tide gate location that you see is fairly offset from, what appears to be the historical flow paths through this area. We do have 2 prominent historical tidal channels. This one on the right or to the east really connects more with the downstream channel out in Sand Lake. This is where we're seeing as really the primary targeted breach location. We do see further to the west potential to do some smaller reconnection in the marsh, but a lot of this northwest marsh area does drain towards the center. So I'll show you a couple different views of how that will flow and function, and considering additional breaches. But again, really getting back to that question of predictability, and if we invest this money in the infrastructure, how to make sure, or how to protect it and minimize impact to it. So stepping as far back in time as we could from a historical aerial perspective, and we do still see really these 2 prominent channel connections that were covered by the dike, and again, this eastern one really being kind of lining up as the primary channel. Yeah, just a little more zoomed in here view. And then this kind of looking at, again, how the existing culvert and tide gate location is offset and not really aligned with what would be kind of the primary trunk of this channel network. And between these 2, and I guess this is kind of getting into that question of multiple breaches and multiple bridges. And York, your comment about replacing, kind of removing the existing tide gate and culvert and spanning that, I think that's even more in a location where if we had one bridge over the existing tide gate, and then we had another one over here at our primary, what we view as the primary channel, I think there is some risk in, one of these locations filling in more and one of them scouring, and so having, less predictability or kind of more risk and changes occurring, whereas a single breach would be more predictable. Like that's kind of a baseline statement there, there are certainly other factors to consider and things you could do to mitigate those, but that's kind of where we're ending up with, you know, multiple breaches versus one breach. How we're looking at sizing a single breach, you know, starting with, and this, we did this in the earlier stage, looking at, you know, the marsh area behind the dike or, you know, upstream of this inlet, tidal prism volume, how much water would flow in and out of this breach on a daily basis. This is our hydraulic geometry approach developed by Philip Williams and Associates, now part of ESA for the past 15 years or so. Coming up with a bottom width of 40 feet, sloping up to a top width of 80 feet. So this is where we're coming at roughly 100-foot opening size as the minimum. That is hydraulically appropriate for the size of marsh behind it. It does still look like a constriction when you zoom out. You know, 100-foot breach on this long levee is still seems small, but our modeling, even during the 100-year flows, do show that the velocities are quite low through that breach and would essentially stay below 2 feet per second most of the time. And then also thinking about what's reasonable to span with a pedestrian bridge. So thinking of that 150-foot span range as a threshold where things start to become a lot more expensive for a bridge, and looking at all these to kind of minimize the potential for constriction hydraulically, as well as how that would affect scour and erosion around a new structure. Couple
Hunter,
of questions. Yeah, go
you
ahead.
see him. Cool.
Chris, or York, go ahead. You first.
Sorry. Just one kind of clarification, you know, back to the levee breaches, you know, I just want people to consider, you know, a levee breach doesn't necessarily mean a channel. You're just removing fill, and you could put that area back to whatever natural grade it was without being an actual active channel too. So, you know, like I said, just getting back to that point of, you know, taking fill out of a wetland and then putting it back, you know, keeping it, you know, I definitely get Hunter's point about stability and predictability. But like I said, just wanted to keep it in folks' mind that a dike breach doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a flowing active channel through that location. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, York. Chris Knudsen.
Hunter, can you go back a couple slides? Yeah, that one right there. So I was just curious, there's a linear feature to the right of your arrows, your channel arrows. Yeah, what is that?
Yeah, this is the drainage ditch that starts to show up really prominently in the 1950s aerial photos. You know, that has been a process, or, you know, changing throughout the years of some of the ditching that has occurred and how it's related to the timing of the dike. You know, the dike was present in the 1939 aerial where this ditch really wasn't, or I guess you kind of see the start of a ditch here, which kind of disappears in the 50s aerial, and then in the 70s aerial, the more prominent, deeper ditch, actually, you know, not in this same location, but yeah, it is essentially a drainage ditch that's been cut, and you know, we see that across the site. I mean, when we start to get into the question of filling drainage ditches and putting in new tidal channels and comparing it to the historical features that we see out there, you know, yeah, there has been substantial ditching occurred over time and loss of some of the historical.
Those aren't pilings on top of the spoils there, right?
No.
Okay. And
No,
then can you go back one?
Shrubs.
Can you go back one more slide?
Historical or to this guy here?
Back to the 1939 aerial. One more. There you go. So this there's a road. Is that approximately where the beaver dam is now?
It is, interestingly. There was an access road across. You know, I think the beaver dam is just downstream of where this old road is. I think this road lines up a bit more with the ditch network that exists behind the beaver dam. But yeah, it is pretty interesting to see, you know, a feature crossing the marsh roughly where we're proposing now.
So the existing beaver dam isn't comprised at all of the old road fill there.
No, I don't believe so. Yeah, like I said, if I could try to overlay these a bit better, but so there is a ditch network that kind of tees or comes together roughly where this road is, but then there's a ditch segment that continues to the north where the beaver dam is a little bit further downstream to the north of this.
So where would that road be in relation to alternative 1?
Yeah, so here you can kind of see these, there's kind of a manifold of ditches kind of all moving to the north, and then they all combine into this east-west ditch that funnels them to the center of the site. I think that old road cut was right around where this east to west ditch line is. And then again, there's a channel segment or a ditch segment that flows to the north where it's dammed up by the beaver dam. So the beaver dam has impoundment within this primary ditch, and then it backwaters the ditch network as well. And when I refer to the beaver dam, it is the main beaver dam. There are a number of dams out there. There's one, a few hundred feet downstream. There's a pretty substantial one that does overtop regularly. And there's a number of smaller dams all throughout the system. There's a active beaver lodge, roughly where I'm pointing now. That answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Malia.
I was just going to say that, Hunter and I were out there just recently hiking and all that. And yeah, we would have loved to have had a road back there to help us when we were slogging. We literally learned how to walk on water. So no, that whatever roadway was there has long since been removed.
Yeah, and while we're talking about that road, not to divert too much, but I am curious, Chris specifically, or excuse me, Jason Elkins, if this road appears in this photo, if you really zoom in, that there was some sort of underpass here beneath the roadway. We're pretty zoomed out here, but it does seem like there's kind of disturbance on this side, and apparently a underpass that would have connected into the marsh. So I don't know if this was a kind of a cattle underpass moving out to the marsh, and if anybody has that that knowledge.
I am not sure. It is interesting. I noted that the current residence that I reside in now is not shown. Well, at least I can't really see it. There's a residence alongside the road, or a structure, a barn structure. But no, I'm not aware of any underpass that was there at all.
There
Or
was
that still remains.
the old histories, the oral histories that were recorded, did indicate that there was an underpass in that location. So we do have record of that.
Huh.
Yeah, it seems, the east side seems to have been filled in, and yeah, Malia and I were kind of poking around there and pondering that as well, and didn't see any direct evidence of that now. Yeah, I mean, Chris Lady, I don't know if you have or would be able to look into your records of any former bridges in this or these nearby locations. But anyway, again, not to divert too far, but oh yeah, go ahead, Chris. You have a comment?
We may or may not have anything in the records. Is it worth my time to dig into the records, or is this really more of a, hey, this is interesting to know?
A curiosity. Yeah, I think it is more of that. I mean, as we move forward, I'll talk a little bit more about the geotechnical considerations and how we would look to tie in a setback dike on this east side. That may become, more of an interesting question in the future, but yeah, I don't think it's an urgent thing to sort out. Certainly a curiosity.
I was just going to say, Chris, years and years ago when this thing was first starting, we were given access to copy all of the historical records that could be found on this related to county roads. And we found nothing in the record regarding a culvert going underneath the road for cows. But I can say the oral history very strongly says that that was there at some point or time.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and really, just an interesting note, as Chris Knutson had pointed out, that there was at one point a road, some sort of road, access road, roughly where we're looking at a new setback dike. So to move forward a little bit, you know, again, this is essentially what a roughly 100-foot dike breach spanned by a pedestrian bridge would look like, lined up with the primary channel flow path. And it's also kind of a gap in the trees along the existing levee. Although I do want to point out, you know, if this setback, or excuse me, if the outer dike is maintained as the trail in the future, there are some potential improvements that would be needed. Both, you know, as we've seen, there's a lot of erosion that's already occurred around the existing structure. So if you did want to reseal this as dike again, or as an embankment, there would be some need to reconstruct that embankment, kind of fill it back in to match the adjacent side slopes, potentially with some armoring and you know, filling of these deep holes. York, you're making good points as far as, you know, do you really want to fill that, or do you want to, you know, bridge that as well? And again, certainly interested in hearing others' thoughts and you know, opinions about these options as we look ahead. You know, the predictability nature has kind of driven our thinking on a single breach, but and the ability to span it with a fairly large pedestrian bridge. Again, these being a couple of representative examples in those span ranges. And then really looking at, you know, full removal, broad removal of the dike and allowing this to be more of a broad adjustable channel connection that could morph on its own. And but that would eliminate the trail that, you know, has been connected to this parking lot trailhead. You know, this is what we're showing for a boardwalk option, and really just to start to get a sense of the scale of the cost, so we can think about the trade-offs associated with this sort of option in this location, or again, reconfiguring the whole trail network to run to the south around the marsh and potentially cross on a setback dike. You know, thinking about where that trail would need to connect to. Right now, we're showing it tying in roughly to the Elk Knoll viewpoint area that is essentially, you know, connecting to the trail network. A boardwalk, as I said, you know, it's not just the short span, you know, short spacing piers that would be needed. There are some locations where we would be talking about 100-foot bridge, boardwalk bridge over some of these channels. And then again, comparing this to a similar system in the Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge near Olympia, where, yes, this one is also subjected to tides. You can see it's essentially out in open water during high tide, and then crossing, you know, mud flats and marsh at low tide. This is all pressure treated wood, and you know, does have long-term maintenance implications. And we would be, you know, needing to do more investigation in the geotechnical conditions and what the foundation would really look like here, what would be appropriate. You know, this I did want to point out as kind of this caution of undersizing a bridge. And, you know, this is what happened out there in Nisqually when they initially put in a 40-foot span bridge over one of the primary channels out there. You know, 5 to 10 years later, they were seeing a lot of erosion in the channel, wanting to enlarge based on the new connection, and they have since replaced that with a 90-foot span bridge. And so, you know, again, seeing some of the stabilization measures that they attempted before upsizing the bridge, but even that, you know, it is all wood. You know, the bridge is a Western woods structure, and certainly has, you know, lifespan and maintenance implications in the future. I did look into as another option for kind of addressing that maintenance concern about, you know, concrete boardwalk system. And, you know, and then this photo also kind of points out this concrete option that certainly would be less long-term maintenance, quite a bit more expensive upfront cost, but you can see the impact that goes along with putting in a boardwalk, even that's intended to be, you know, light impact on the marsh, but certainly not no impact involved there. Chris Lady, see your hands up.
So one of the things to mitigate that is typically when you do a bridge, you span right from the end of the abutment to the end of the abutment, and it is all open space. one of the things that can be done to minimize that is you still have, call it a 150-foot bridge, but you keep 10 feet on either side of the abutment. And that allows the water to do whatever maneuvering it wants to. So instead of spanning 150 feet, you end up spanning 130 feet. And that gives you 10 feet of buffer on either side. That helps to contain the flow of that. So it also helps raising up. The closer to the ocean we get, the more concern we have with waves and overtopping, and certainly a bridge being higher up is going to withstand that, and you have less material in the water with the piles or the piers that we saw in these images. So certainly ways to accommodate that, but bring that up in this area because that would reduce the amount of a full breach that you have by, call it 20 feet.
Yeah, and we're still throwing around fairly rough numbers of the breach size and the span size, but what we've modeled is actually an 80-foot top width breach. And so even when what we're showing here, we're kind of upping those numbers and planning just to kind of give some buffer, give some room for movement, adjustment, not having to armor. That's what we want to avoid as well, is the need to armor these openings. So, this potentially a good discussion as well. And, Cami, some of your thinking around, the natural kind of reconnection, what would be the benefits of full dike removal? And is it worth the added, logistics, impacts to trails and cost? It would be the most natural way to return this site to what it once was by removing that artificial fill that bisects the marsh and Sand Lake. Our big question that we try to answer through the modeling is does the larger breach or full removal change water levels or circulation patterns, and how would that influence sediment dynamics and accretion, which is a tough question to answer, the accretion and sediment dynamics question, but the 100-foot breach is big enough to equalize water levels. So we saw no difference in modeled water levels behind the dike under a 100-foot breach, a 200-foot breach, or a full removal. We do see difference in circulation patterns, and I'll show you that here in a minute. York, your points of just restoring wetland within these areas of the footprint of the existing dike, that certainly is a benefit. And then is there a use for the dike fill material for the setback dike, which is logistically challenging from a timing perspective if you need to essentially build your setback dike before you remove an outer dike. But in this case, because it's already connected, there are some ways that you could be harvesting material off of this outer dike to build the new dike if it were determined to be suitable. The disadvantages of full dike removal are the impact to the trail is the big one, and what it would mean to reroute the trail, reconfigure the trail network so relative to the trailhead area and parking, boardwalk and the impact and everything that go along with that, and really the cost. I mean, it's hard to deny the massive difference in cost under a full removal and boardwalk option. I'll get a bit into more of that, but to a boardwalk of this size and ranging from these different types of the pressure treated Nisqually style versus the permatrack concrete boardwalk, we're talking $3 to $5 million for a boardwalk like that, let alone just excavating and hauling this material away kind of in the $1 million range plus, compared to 100 to 150 foot pedestrian bridge, could be on the order of 500,000 to $1 million, depending on foundation and material type and so forth. And then, impacts to trees on the existing dike. And, if you do remove the full dike, what does that do to the potential for wind wave erosion off of Sand Lake and, changing fetch distance across the open water and, potential changes in vulnerability to the south end of the marsh? Cami, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, great, thanks. You can leave it on this slide for me, actually. I am disappointed to see that the boardwalk is linked to the cost of the full removal of the dike. Again, I think because I think there are some other alternatives that aren't being considered fully as far as accessing that west side from a southern location. So I don't know if that's, you know, is that truly a package deal that if the full dike is removed, a boardwalk is what we're moving toward, because I would actually hate to see that. I've been at the Nisqually site before the boardwalk was there, when the full 5.5 mile walking trail, which was the dike, was intact. I've walked it. I spent time with Gene Takakawa when they were dealing with the public engagement process to modify that existing dam structure, and how they even came up with the boardwalk is all related to that. The nick points and the scour that you see at those openings in the Nisqually, that's what we're going to be dealing with here for sure, because if you leave any of that existing structure and you have sheet flow, and especially when you start to factor in sea level rise and timing of storm surge with king tides, especially if those align, wherever you have sheet flow and then you have a narrow opening, I don't care really how narrow, you're altering the velocities in that opening, and you've impacted it from what it would be naturally, which is a depositional marsh that, you know, accretes, you know, on every full tidal event, to a transport velocity at those locations where those breaches are perpetuated. So it's going to be a continual chasing of our tails to just to link those two. And you're going to have the same kinds of issues with the boardwalk as well, just because of how that's going to impact and the cost of, you know, maintaining that. So
Yeah.
Anyway,
I would, you know, and yeah, that's a good point about these two actions being linked, you know, the full removal of the dike, really with, you know, the question being, how do you maintain the trail under that scenario? But I did, you know, break this down in cost for just removing the dike itself and off-hauling that material. You know, we're talking about 25,000 cubic yards of fill comprising of the dike. If we were to take it down to about 7 feet, the, you know, rough marsh plain elevation out there, you know, that being a little over $1 million, you know, round numbers here. But, you know, even if it's not the boardwalk replacing the dike in the location that we've shown, you know, kind of spanning the mid marsh there, you know, if you do remove the dike, you have to, assuming you want to maintain connectivity to the rest of the trail network on the west side, you know, rerouting the trails, and whether that be, again, through the belts, or excuse me, through the Reneke Creek area,
right
back to, so I mean, this is a, you know, very interesting zone, as well as Reneke Creek has, you know, moved itself down here and is, you know, sorting sediment. Conrad and I were out there the other day and seeing just a ton of fish and really interesting conditions developing down there. But yes, you could certainly route the trail on high ground, or, you know, some of this would likely be boardwalk, route yourself, get yourself through the Belts Creek area and out onto a setback dike. I mean, there may be a different way to reconnect the trails, but we're still talking about, you know, a lot of reworking, likely a fair amount of boardwalks to do that across some of these wetter areas. And, you know, I think just the question of cost, you know, whether it's this 3 million to 5 million for this boardwalk, or if it's a, you know, 3 million or 2 million for other trail reconfiguration and other boardwalk segments, you know, there is certainly a cost trade-off.
I think I would just make the argument that higher ground long-term maintenance and overall cost is much reduced. I mean, significantly reduced. When you're spanning across full, you know, tidal sheet flow, and the uncertainty about the future levels and conditions of that, and, you know, wood that might come in, or wood that might be moving out, or, you know, just the various factors that you would need to consider. I just argue that there's some other alternatives that maybe aren't fully portrayed here that might be less costly.
Yeah, I mean, what are you thinking of as far as other alternatives?
Going south from the parking lot on that higher
Yeah.
ground and connecting across the setback levee, if that's a requirement in this effort. And then some consideration of a full removal of the dike, at least, and consideration of that material being incorporated into these other, whether that incorporated into the higher ground work that might take place, or the Renicky side of the system. I think there's ways to connect those activities and reduce costs, and just really look at a long-term alternative that gets more at that initial intent of the acquisition of the property and full restoration of the processes. I'll stop talking.
Yeah.
I'll let other folks.
Oh, no, great.
chat.
Great points. And yeah, I think we can I can certainly look at another trail reconfiguration option and try to get some relative costs for that as well to compare. And I'll get into a little bit more about just what we're seeing in the modeling of these different sizes and full removal, kind of the differences that we see in the model there. York.
Yeah, I really appreciate all Cammie's comments and agree. But to get back to, the alternatives as well, something to consider, like, we keep talking about the cost of this boardwalk, but there's going to be a cost of maintaining the dike too, and you can't forget about that. And, maintaining a structure that's potentially beautiful and not as detrimental as a levee, I think, is an easier sale than fixing a levee with hard riprap and things like that. Another thing I want to throw out too is, talking about the levee and levee removal and at what elevation do you stop. I noticed, you put this boardwalk in a different location. Was there consideration of putting a boardwalk over a lowered levee base? So maintaining, the bottom 5 feet of the levee or whatever, engineers think is great, and putting your boardwalk across the old existing levee and utilizing that to a certain extent. And then also, get back to Cammie's point, I want to see this, restored to the most natural possible. That's really what's going to benefit water quality. And if 150-foot span bridge is reasonable in quotation marks, I would definitely like that to be talked about over a 100-foot span bridge. So just some comments out there. But I really like the amount of thought that's gone into this and the planning and consideration. But yeah, I think we should try to utilize any option that we can think of moving forward. Thanks.
Yeah, and just real quick on the location or considering a boardwalk across the existing dike interface, the thought was pushing it further to the south to kind of reduce its exposure. Under this alternative where we're removing the dike, I mean, certainly this outer area where there is some rock on the outside of the dike now, there is certainly more open water and wind wave action out in that location. I think the big thing though is the potential for the channel connections to evolve. I think being more likely out in kind of on the outer interface where we do see these old 2 very prominent channels, and likely if this were fully removed, there would be some potential for this to shift around, and maybe both of these are flowing and upsizing as well. And so I think pushing the boardwalk further to the south, we're looking at shorter spans of potential bridges and reducing the exposure, bringing a potential boardwalk further off of the lake, the open water. But, again, I think the decision point would still be the same as far as, what are the benefits of the full dike removal, and is the cost, whether it's a boardwalk in the location of the dike in the, mid-span, mid-marsh crossing, or some other reconfiguration to the south, really looking at the, what are we going to get out of that? And yeah, agreeing that it's kind of worth that cost. And so I guess just to kind of get more towards the effects, this just the bullet here is that we're not seeing any difference in water levels, that the different sizes of breaches or full dike removal generate the same water levels behind the dike. Where we do see difference is in circulation. And, these two images here, the one on the left is the 100-foot dike breach, and certainly zoomed out at this level, it looks like a tiny little breach, tiny constriction, where water in the marsh funnels into this constriction point and out through this small breach. During lower water levels, because of, there's some interesting aspects of Sand Lake that it doesn't drop all the way. It only drops to 5.5 feet. So we only see the upper half of the tide cycle in Sand Lake. At these lower water levels below 7 feet, which is, 75% of water levels, water is still funneling into this central channel location, even with full dike removal. The difference is at higher water levels, when the whole marsh is inundated and when water is, pushing across the full interface, if there was no dike here, versus, this is showing drain out when, we get some pretty big eddies on the upstream side and potential for scour, and water does, constrict and move through this opening. So yes, zoomed out at this level, at these higher water levels, you do see this as a constriction. One quick thing to notice that up here at the top left, the northwest side, there's a spot, low point in the dike that overtops at these 12-foot modeled water levels. So this kind of getting at a location that would potentially need to be improved, raised, or bridged, reconnected up on that area as well. And then just to Kami, I'll call on you in just 1 second. What we are seeing for peak velocities under these different breach scenarios. So we've kind of changed the scale to really highlight the difference in velocity. This is at the absolute peak moment during the 100-year storm and a maximum tide swing drain out. We get 3 feet per second velocity peak through this 100-foot breach opening. And this is a plot of velocities through the entire 100-year king tide modeled event, where with that 100-foot breach, we're typically at, half a foot per second, 1 foot per second, clipping 2 feet per second during these big tides and 2-year flows. And it's really only during that king tide and 100-year flow syncing up and peak drain out moment when we're exceeding 2 feet per second through that breach opening, and even at that case staying below 3 feet per second, which is pretty modest velocity. Again, when you zoom out and you look at this constriction here, it certainly does look like a small breach relative to the whole interface that water could be moving across, but the velocities are still quite low. Looking at this from not only velocity but shear stress, which would drive erosion, we're comparing this to 0.19 pounds per square foot of shear stress. That shear stress has the potential to erode gravels, coarse and medium gravels. As we would start to get into higher velocities and kind of getting into the 7-8 foot per second, that's when we really start to get into riprap armoring and things like that. And so where we're in this range of velocities that we're talking about right now, it's really has the potential to mobilize gravels, which I think leads us to think that we wouldn't have to armor this very much, even with a 100-foot dike breach. And then looking at a 200-foot dike breach, so doubling that size, peak velocities through the opening are less than 1 foot per second, even during that full simulation of drain out. And again, one big factor there, like I mentioned, is that Sand Lake never drops below 5.5. So we're only seeing the upper half of the tide cycle, and we really don't hit that, even the steepest part of a tide cycle drain out, where you really often do get some of the strongest forces it just doesn't occur in Sand Lake because of the various bed features between this dike and the outer marsh. Retains water back. It never lets water fall below that 5.5 foot water level. Under this 200-foot breach scenario, again, really low velocities in the breach itself. You know, we do see a little bit higher velocities in the channels immediately upstream that are smaller than the breach itself. But again, still below 2 feet per second in those channels as well. And then kind of a point of comparison here, the Whalen Island Bridge that I think most folks are familiar with, you know, has a substantially larger contributing marsh area, about 180 acres roughly that drain out through this opening compared to the roughly 80 acres at Sitka Sedge. The Whalen Island Bridge is an 80-foot span, roughly 78, and it's heavily armored. You know, heavy riprap in this opening. You know, there are some big scour holes on either side of it, and that were present before this bridge went in. You know, I know there are some relatively high velocities through this opening, and so I'm not saying this is what we're shooting for necessarily, but just a point of comparison that, you know, this 80-foot span on the Whalen Island Bridge compared to the 100-foot, 150, you know, 200-foot breach sizes that we're evaluating out at the Belts Dike and with full removal. So, you know, I'll kind of run through what I'm seeing as the conclusions here is that, you know, the single breach is much more predictable than multiple breaches. The 100-foot breach certainly appears to be a constriction compared to historical conditions, but the shear stresses and model velocities are quite low. The 150-foot bridge span is reasonable in quotes, and the larger bridge spans do get more expensive, particularly if you want to have you know, ability to run a truck across it. We see no difference in water levels between the different breach sizes or full removal, but as I showed you, there are some differences in how water funnels and circulates in the marsh. You know, the question about accretion and changes, influence on sedimentation is a very tough question to answer. You know, as that water is funneling in, you know, we certainly would see higher velocities in these main channels. You know, that could be beneficial potentially to keep these channels maintained and open. But we still see very low velocities on the marsh plain itself. And really, you know, the other factors that really would influence accretion and sedimentation are the supply of sediment and the duration of inundation on the marsh surface. And neither one of those factors are significantly affected by the breach size. Certainly interested to hear Cami or Leah, I see you've got your hand up, you know, your thoughts on that question about accretion and sedimentation processes relative to these different options. And then just to close out on these, you know, again, pointing out the substantial impact to recreation or the cost associated with accommodating that. And then, yeah, as we've noted, you know, concerns about a boardwalk, both from an impact and a maintenance standpoint. Leah.
My mute there. Yeah, Hunter, do you mind explaining a little bit on you said there's no difference between the water levels in the different scenarios. Is that the extent of inundation or also the duration of inundation that you're seeing?
Yeah, basically what I'm saying there is that, you know, the 100-foot breach itself is big enough to allow water in. You know, yes, it is a neck point, it is a constriction, but it's big enough of an opening that it allows water levels to equilibrate. So the water level that you see out in Sand Lake propagates into the marsh with the 100-foot breach. So for example, with the existing culvert that's out there, 4x4, 4 foot by 4 foot culvert, that constriction is small enough that we don't see the full tides propagating back into the marsh. But with the 100-foot breach, we do see full equilibration of water levels and no difference in upstream water levels in the marsh between these different breaching options or removal options.
Gotcha. Okay. That's and I don't have a for sure answer on the circulation question, but I was looking at that and thinking about sediment movement and seeing some of those eddies that are predicted would make me think that you'd have areas of deposition, much more heterogeneous little like bars and points of deposition behind the existing dike than you would in the full breach scenario. But
Yeah, I mean, our
Yeah.
company has done a lot of work, in the San Francisco Bay, and really in a lot of these berms are actually used to slow water down and create these slack water zones that may encourage sedimentation or encourage sediment dropping out, not uniformly. I mean, I think that's a question where, this full reconnection option, you may end up with a more uniform accretion rate across the marsh, whereas with these constrictions and slow areas and faster moving areas, I think you would have more dynamic nature of sedimentation and less consistency, I guess, or homogeneity. Cami, sorry, Leah, anything else on yours? Yeah.
I think Malia had her hand up first.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
Malia.
that's okay. I'll wait.
Yeah, just one real quick question. Did any of your modeling consider looking at rerouting Reneke Creek back so that it is in full connection with the estuary north of the dike? And how would that impact the flow rates that you're looking at?
Yeah, we didn't model that, and just to let you know, we are working on that as a separate study of Reneke Creek alignment, and that's definitely not the focus of what we're looking at today. But I will say that the channel, you can kind of see it here. We see Reneke really lighting up with these 100-year flows moving through it, and water in its current channel where it hits the road and runs down the roadside drainage ditch down to the low point. We also see during these higher water levels more of this floodplain activation and it's spreading out. You can also see this old Reneke channel, which I see pop up throughout the historical aerials, that this being a manipulated, man-made channel. What we can discern in the oldest aerials, we do see these other tidal channels in the area of Reneke Creek, coming through here, and where they do, I would theorize that they are connecting to what was the old Reneke Creek. This is 1939. We don't see this Reneke kind of ditch channel that flows out around the dike or through the upper end of the dike, and we do see that pop up in the 50s aerial, and you see it more in the 70s. But we didn't look at that effect. Really the forces in this model are, of course, the stream inputs, and they are substantial. And sorry, kind of jumping around to try to get at some of these questions, but this being our hydrograph that we've developed for this scenario, where we end up with a kind of a 2-year flow starting out and running into a 100-year flow of it on all these creeks. Reneke certainly is the biggest contribution to freshwater in the marsh, but what we see in the modeling is that really these higher water levels, in all cases, even when you do have the 100-year flows filling the marsh, it's ultimately limited by the outboard tide levels. And so the water flowing into the marsh from the tide is substantially larger than the volume of water that the creeks are contributing. And Reneke is the biggest one, and so it's contributing the most water. But I guess to directly answer your question, no, we didn't model the difference of how the dike, the marsh and areas would be affected by rerouting of Reneke. But once you've made the substantial breach connection, the dynamics in the marsh are really driven more by the tides, the in and out of the tides, than the inflows from the creeks. The big influence that the creeks have is when there is a dike in place, or there are these impoundments that can fill up with the fresh water. But once you've made this open connection to Sand Lake, the exchange of tidewater really dominates, and the creek influence becomes less. Malia, I don't know if that answered your question or if you have follow up there, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, I'm just trying to sort out options of the best way to get, improve our fish habitat, because Reneke Creek is our main fish bearing stream. And it definitely will benefit getting connected to the estuary one way, shape, or form or another.
Absolutely. And yeah, like I said, we are looking at a kind of a separate study right now of alignment of Reneke Creek. We're really replacing, the structure and the road overtopping that occurs there now. Working on that along with an assessment of the historical alignments of Reneke Creek, the high flow pathways of Reneke Creek, and the habitat, value that's developed downstream of the road where Reneke Creek is flowing now, as well as looking at these other historical options, including the, what I'm seeing as more of a ditched version of Reneke Creek that used to run along the parking lot and out a culvert through the dike. But that's potentially a whole separate conversation. And again, I think as far as where we're talking about the setback dike locations, really unrelated to Reneke Creek, which I do think we should kind of transition into some of the setback dike content as I'm kind of watching our time slip away here. But yeah, hopefully that did answer some of your questions, and feel free to let me know if there's additional things you want to discuss or look into there. Cami?
Yeah, I'm glad I let Malia go first because mine was about Reneke as well a little bit, and then I want to go to the slide where you show the velocities with the dike breach. But while you're here, that road is built on the alluvial fan and where the topography changes, it's a tough spot to be working, and it's difficult, when you try to entertain restoration of natural processes. This is often the case where you have infrastructure or a road or a house right where these processes are occurring. And so any sediments coming down Reneke, once they come out onto this flat, any material carried in that stream flow is going to be dropping out and changing that channel. And typically in these alluvial fan areas where the road is built, it's a real challenge to accommodate that. So and then my other comment was about the question, and back to Reneke, that what we have learned is from the salmon recovery standpoint, that freshwater input and the significant amount of freshwater mixing with the tidal conditions here that provide those salinity gradients that the young rearing salmonids key in on. And so, just backing up what Malia was saying, any level of reconnection there is that we can, however we can improve that is going to benefit, the salmonids that are using this area.
I think to maybe clarify or point your question or your thoughts a bit more there. I think what we're talking about on Reneke is, right now Reneke flows down, hits the road embankment where its whole culvert is filled in, runs down the roadside ditch, and then flows out this low point culvert. And from what I am telling and can tell, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, both of these connections existed. It's not that Reneke used to all flow out through this culvert that got filled in. As far back as I can tell in recent history, it has always split that way. That some water would flow out this way, some water would make its way down to the low point and flow out. It hasn't been a full shift in flow, but at this point, it is all directed down to this low point. And what Malia is referring to is where it used to cross in this culvert that has filled in. There was essentially an excavated channel that flows around the backside of the parking lot and flows out a culvert through the dike. And so I think what Malia is asking about is the question of rerouting Reneke Creek to flow outside of Belt's dike. And so Cami, just wanted to maybe have you elaborate a bit on the, the benefit or the, salinity gradients, et cetera, that would be affected by that action.
Yeah.
Where water's coming in now, it is kind of feeding the marsh, particularly not in these times of high tidal exchange. But if you were to reroute it kind of back through this kind of ditch channel and outside to the lake, you would kind of be losing that fresh water to the marsh itself. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
I have thoughts on that. I'll make them brief, but I would say altering that is not desirable. I would say allowing that mixing to occur. I mean, of course, we have fish passage issues and we have a number of other issues going on, but the long-term goal to restore the natural processes, I would say that freshwater input into the marsh is important. And we've even learned that young rearing salmonids key in on certain salinity gradients where there's that freshwater input and spend most of the summer in these estuarine channels, rearing and growing and preparing to go to the ocean. So it's a really important part of the young rearing salmon to allow for those different mixing zones. And so just truncating that and shunting it out to the other side of the system, I wouldn't say that we have as much good data for or rationale for that necessarily as we do to just kind of allow again that natural mixing. Really quick, I wanted to point out on the slides where you showed those velocity gradients with the upper southern dike, yeah, that one there. The eddying that's occurring there in your modeling this is primarily a freshwater event that you're portraying and a king tide, is that right?
Yeah, the event is essentially it's a 10-day simulation that includes modest tide, kind of 10-foot tides and 2-year flows, and then really ramps up and combines 12-foot tides, king tide levels, extreme tides with 100-year flows. So, we have other runs that we've used that are less extreme, but a lot of what we're looking at for erosion potential or peak velocities are really under these most extreme scenarios.
Right.
So this is part of our 100-year flow.
So I just wanted to point out that with the climate change modeling, the predictions are that there'll be an increase in the frequency of the collision of these events. For instance, like the big freshwater events with the king tide, but timing is kind of everything. So it may be that eddying occurs when the event is more driven by a freshwater event, but you might have the same kind of eddying on the west side of that or the north side of that if the tide is the pressure and the freshwater and the timing of the hydrograph is different. So from a maintenance standpoint, it's just really interesting for me to think about these nick points. And I know that what you were saying about the velocities not being too terribly high in a tidal marsh, those are high, and the impacts again, from a maintenance standpoint and from a just a consideration of habitat and the makeup of these systems, it's an unnatural feature that will be potentially more frequent and could pose more issues with whatever we do try to keep in those locations. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great comments. And again, yeah, certainly, trade-offs between maintaining the trail, the infrastructure, and how high a velocity is too high for different reasons. Yeah, great comments. Jason, got a question, comment?
Yeah, just a couple quick notes on that channel of Renicky that was created to bring the creek on the other side of the dike, the estuary side of the dike. Of note, local property owners said that it would flood their property quite often when it historically flowed on the north side of the dike there. So just consideration, food for thought. And then there were salmon in Renicky Creek over this winter in December. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, and again, Conrad and I were out there last week and kind of poking around this area downstream of Sand Lake Road, and even, you know, we saw a ton of fish both downstream and immediately upstream. We even kind of saw them dashing through the culvert. You know, not apparently going much further up where we were seeing, but again, a lot of fish, apparently salmonids in this area now as it's developing.
Nice.
Also a very dynamic area. I mean, there's a ton of sediment sorting taking place in here, and the channel really braiding out. You know, some beaver activity helping that along, and yeah, really an interesting area. And yeah, again, a whole nother topic to dive into at some point. So in the interest of time here, you know, I know we've talked a lot about the dike breach and what happens there. You know, I do really want to focus more of the conversation here on the setback dike and kind of what we've looked at there. You know, I think, I don't know if we did get any indication of folks signing off at noon versus sticking around another hour, but I'll try to just get through kind of the findings and some of the other complications around this setback dike and new structure, and then have some additional discussion. So again, the big reason why, you know, I wanted to evaluate these different setback dike locations is around understanding the impact to the wetland of creating this dike, and looking at, are there other less impactful ways to create the setback dike and have it still function the way, you know, we need it to. So really starting with this location on the setback dike, or excuse me, on the existing beaver dam. And then there's a lot of fine detailed logistics of, you know, is it on the beaver dam or downstream of the beaver dam, et cetera. But that's the location that had been initially identified and evaluated at a high level of feasibility for storage. You know, these other ones push the dike further south. Alternative 3 actually is configured such that the northwest ditch coming out of Tierra del Mar would flow outside of the setback dike. Punchline on that is that while that northwest flow path certainly has issues for drainage and, you know, flooding and ponding in Tierra del Mar, the amount of water between that's in that northwest ditch flow path is very small compared to the amount of water coming down Sand Lake Road's culvert, or certainly the water coming through the East Marsh. So this alternative didn't really pan out or really show anything significant, and the just turning off this input of water from the northwest ditch really didn't have much of an impact on how alternative 2 would perform. You know, thinking that if we were able to potentially reroute some of the northwest ditch, some of the runoff from Tierra del Mar, would a further south alternative like alternative 2 become more feasible? But it didn't really. And so, yeah, I guess this is kind of looking at the flow inputs that we have coming in behind a setback dike. And, you know, again, while certainly there's some drainage implications and issues in this northwest flow path, the amount of water that it contributes is quite small compared to the other inputs. Just for reference, there's, you know, some key elevations here. 100-year flood level is 11.8. All these are in AVD 88. Sand Lake never drops below 5.5 feet in its current state with the sand bed features. The beaver dam here impounds water behind it that never drops below 7.5 to 8 feet. And so the south end of the marsh is essentially always ponded at those levels at, you know, 7 to 8 feet, depending on inputs. And the low point in Sand Lake Road at the East Marsh crossing is 11.6 feet. So when we talk about these 12-foot tides, they would potentially overtop that low point in Sand Lake Road. And when we look at performance of the setback dike, we're also looking at, you know, how much water would build up behind the setback dike and what that water surface elevation would mean for Sand Lake Road, as well as, you know, further back in the East Marsh and the northern properties in Tierra del Mar. You know, these plots here are really just kind of saying the same thing I just did, that, you know, the beaver dam stays high. It doesn't let water drop below 7, you know, between 7 and 8 feet. And while we do have full tidal swing in the ocean all the way down to 0, Sand Lake never drops below 5.5 feet. So again, we're only seeing that upper half of the tide cycle. Really important to note here. And then during wet season, it doesn't change that much, but what we see is with the existing dike, that when we get rainfall coming in, filling the basin behind the dike, you know, we get this issue of just, it takes a long time for the system to drain out. And in the same way, the area upstream of the Beaver Dam, we see small peaks, but, you know, very moderated water levels upstream of the Beaver Dam. This is some current data that shows, this is from the most recent February king tides. It wasn't that exciting from a stream flow perspective, but you know what we did see was that we're seeing tides in Sand Lake about 1.5 feet higher than the South Beach ocean tide. So Sand Lake levels do typically get higher than the tide stations that we look at. The East Marsh, where we put in a logger, is staying steady at 8.2 roughly, and that's essentially the backwater from the Beaver Dam, as well as additional impoundment at the Sand Lake Road culvert. And yeah, we did put one more logger out closer to the mouth of Sand Lake, and it does drop further down, but it still is limited. It didn't drop below 3. So we do see Sand Lake has several bed features moving up from the mouth to where we interact with it at Belts Dike that impounds water and cuts off the lower half of the tide cycle. That's the main point there. And then this just quick analysis of the effect of the tide gate missing now compared to what it was in 2017. So back in 2017, we were seeing about a 2-foot difference in tide and water level in Belts Marsh. And now with the 2023 water level data, we're seeing it about 0.5 foot more water accumulating, or tide water getting in based on the missing tide gate. So it has changed some. I'll kind of breeze past some of this stuff. These are details about the hydrologic scenarios that were developed related to, the 100-year water surface elevation. So 12 foot is this peak water level that we're really focusing on. Although noting that, max tide at South Beach is reported as 11.6, and noting that Sand Lake tides have been 1.5 feet higher sometimes than the ocean tide. 13 is really what seems like the max extreme tide to consider in Sand Lake. And so I'll show you a little bit about some inundation extents under those scenarios, but yeah, 12-foot king tides with all these big 100-year storm flows. We took real stream flows, we scaled them up based on nearby stream. We're tracking our Reneke Creek 100-year peak flow at about 274, which comparing that to stream stats at 238. So we may have a little bit more extreme 100-year flow event taking place, but I think that's, it's just a more conservative approach. And, stream stats is a rough tool. It's not always that accurate. So, but we do feel good about the fact that we have created this very extreme event to run these model scenarios through. And, again, these are kind of wanting to compare it to existing conditions, and existing conditions, as we've talked about in previous phases, is the worst condition possible for drain out and handling storms. What we see even leading up in this event, the blue line here being the existing condition, is that the existing dike does limit tides when there's not a storm taking place. So there is some protective value of the existing dike and culvert with no tide gate. But as soon as we start to get substantial flows, the existing condition fills with water and takes a long time to drain out, particularly once we hit this 100-year flow level. It takes days and days to drain out. So essentially all configurations that we looked at perform better than the existing condition during a big storm event. But again, when we look back in this earlier portion of our simulation, we see the existing conditions do limit the peaks that occur. So, when we compare this to the fully unrestrained, fully reconnected option, the existing dike and the setback dike, the goal of the setback dike is that it would also be limiting those peaks. And, you know, there's a lot of information here. And so I guess I'll try to hone in on this here being essentially a 2-year storm. This is the first storm of our 100-year run. And each one of these lines here is a different version of the setback dike. And maybe as you would guess, this orange one that maintains lower water levels, it really limits the peaks. And once the tide drops, it drains out immediately. It drains out really fast. This is alt 1. This is the setback dike near the existing beaver dam. So what we've seen in the modeling here is that this location performs really well. In most cases, very similar peaks to existing conditions or better than the existing condition as far as peak water levels. And then all of the options drain out very fast compared to existing conditions. As we started to push the setback dike further south, we've reduced the volume of the storage basin, and we are leading to higher peak water levels that, you know, whether it's the tide that causes that peak water level, or when the tide gate is closed and you get fresh water pouring in, it will generate that same water level. The peak water level is essentially limited by the outboard tide. We would never see water levels stacking up higher than the outboard tide because the tide gate that would regulate the outflow or the drainage, once the inboard water level or the upstream water level gets higher than the outboard tide, the tide gate would open and equilibrate those water levels. So yeah, again, it's a lot of information, fairly dense, but just wanted to kind of point out here, alternative 1, setback dike near the beaver dam is really the only version of a setback dike, the only location that can truly improve peak water level conditions. All the other versions of setback dike that we looked at, the basins will fill pretty quickly, and this is only the 2-year event. So when we start to look at with the 100-year event, again, it's this orange, it's the alternative 1 setback dike that truly reduces water levels compared to the existing condition, and all of the other setback dike locations fill up quickly. You know, alternative 2, we've pushed it back 300 feet. It has some tide limiting effect, but does still get higher than existing conditions in this case. And then as we really push it further back, it's essentially allowing the full tide to occur because the basin fills in with fresh water and results in the same peak water levels anyway. Yeah, this is, like I said, rerouting the northwest ditch has no effect. I'll kind of go past that unless anybody has specific questions. And then, you know, looking, so sorry, all the data I was just showing you was essentially water levels at the south end of the marsh. You know, essentially just downstream of the Roma Ave culvert or just downstream of the East Marsh Sand Lake Road culvert. We also looked at water levels in the East Marsh, and, you know, compared to existing conditions that show a similar effect and even more extreme. Water fills in this basin and just stays ponded for days and days at a time. Whereas all these setback dike options, assuming that the Sand Lake Road culvert at the East Marsh is upsized and allows exchange across that road interface, we see similar things. We see the peak tides occurring and really fast drain out. The floor on all of this data is essentially the beaver dam elevation. And, you know, because of that impoundment, assuming it stays, persists under each of these options, water levels at the south end of Sand Lake, or excuse me, at the south end of Belts Marsh near Tierra del Mar do not fall below 8.5 feet, particularly during these big storms. York, do you have a question?
Thanks. I tried to hold this question, but I couldn't help myself anymore. So, you know, I understand how the current beaver dam is setting levels at 8 feet, right?
Yeah.
So when you're doing this analysis and we put in, I assume you probably haven't gotten here yet, so I apologize if I've jumped the gun and I'll just wait. But, you know, we're putting a setback levy, we're putting in a muted tide gate regulator or something. I would assume you're gonna set that tide gate at a lower elevation at the beaver dam, and is all this analysis you're talking about taking that under consideration, or are you not? Are you gonna set the tide gate at the similar elevations to the current beaver dam?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question and a logistical challenge as far as, and that's what I want to get into as well. You know, how would a new setback dike interact with this existing beaver dam? And, you know, if you, and yeah, I definitely have slides that kind of cover this as well, but, you know, the functionality of culverts and tide gates around this beaver dam and the MTR settings. This is also a complicated question because an MTR, folks are hopefully familiar, is allowed to close once a particular water level is reached. You know, in this location, this is pretty unique for MTRs. We would essentially set this MTR to about 8 feet or even higher, where the gate stays open most of the time and only closes when at the very peak of relatively high tides. And you know, kind of getting at this topic of elevation of the culvert, and do you set that culvert lower so that it's, you know, it's underwater, it's impounded, you know, potentially if it's upstream of the beaver dam and the beaver dam remains, it's always backwatered to 8 feet. So there's kind of this ineffective capacity. You know, you can lower that culvert and but if it's backwatered at 8 feet, you know, it's not really flowing at the bottom, you know, half of the culvert. So this does get kind of complicated. And what we've modeled do essentially assume that the beaver dam impoundment remains. And it is more conservative because, you know, yeah, you could go in, you could remove the beaver dam, you could remove all of the beaver dams in the system and get this thing to flow better. But it's likely that the beavers will return and beaver dams will recur, you know, be rebuilt. You know, you know, again, this is a pretty substantial topic to get into as far as, you know, beaver activity and, you know, where are we talking about a setback dike relative to the beaver dam, you know, the main dam, what we're crossing with this embankment, you know, what I'm showing here is looking downstream through this main channel. The main beaver dam is upstream. It's behind me in this photo. And there's another, there are several beaver dams. That's one of the big points here is that even with the amount of tide, like yes, full reconnection or the breaches would allow higher tide levels and more salinity and, you know, more tide water to interact with the site. But I think, and, you know, with a lot of the research taking place in you know, the Skagit River and in Oregon and the Yaquina and Miami River. I mean, we see beaver activity in these tidal areas that have salinity influence. And so I think we've got to assume that the beavers are going to be here after a setback dike goes in. So you know, a lot of our modeling is really focused on these extreme events and highest water levels and you know, as far as looking at flooding and drainage capacity and things like that. So the assumption in the model is that water is impounded at these levels. And, you know, there are logistics of, you know, even in this channel here, you know, yeah, you would likely sink your culvert in deeper. So it does have water in it all the time. But this downstream beaver dam is really limiting how much water can actually move through this channel until water levels are higher. So I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but yes, it is. That's the base assumption as far as how, you know, these impoundments will operate in our modeling. But this is a big discussion that, you know, I do want to kind of get into as far as, you know, beaver activity and how that will influence this structure in the future. You know, just kind of jumping ahead a little bit, you know, getting into what sort of exclusionary measures there are to, you know, protect a structure from being plugged by beavers. And, you know, there's a lot of things being tried. You know, give a reference to Skip Lyle in in Maine or in the East Coast, Beaver Deceivers International, inventor of the Beaver Deceiver device. And, it is essentially this exclusionary fencing that allows the culvert to stay free flowing and conveying water and excluding beaver from getting to this point of plugging your structure. These are not foolproof. They're not maintenance free. They certainly rack debris. Beavers can essentially build a dam on this fence. And I guess we need to all be aware that a setback dike, a new culvert, and a tide gate is going to have, long-term maintenance associated with it to keep it flowing as we've modeled. The model is predicting, full functionality of this new opening and new structure. And so, to make sure that it does function that way well into the future, there is certainly a maintenance component. I'll just quickly reference Smuggler's Slough tide gate in near Bellingham on the Lummi Nation property. This is an MTR tide gate. It stays open most of the time. It was built in a location of heavy beaver activity, and they're continuing to try different things, and honestly sounds like kind of struggle with it. I was talking to somebody about what they've done over time. There's referring to the beaver having packed about 20 cubic yards of mud around this structure to essentially seal it up, and they've done different things of adding exclusion fencing, uncovering it and clearing it out, and it has been kind of a continuous maintenance issue for them. So pointing that out, that the setback dike location near the beaver dam has enough storage to function to contain all that flood water, and as long as it is maintained as free flowing, it will function that way. But there will be some effort required to keep it functional and to keep it clear. And honestly, a lot of the beaver exclusionary measures are somewhat experimental and require a fair amount of adaptive management and maintenance to keep them moving. There's also fish passage implications for this sort of exclusionary fence or exclusionary measures. I pulled a couple of clips out of Greg Apke's presentation to the 2020 Beaver Working Group, where he was talking about some of the fish passage implications of exclusionary devices around culverts. That the typical 6x6 square fencing is acceptable for trout, for resident trout. Once we start to get into wanting adult passage through these areas, which maybe somebody else can speak to that, if we're really trying to get adults into the East Marsh, but or upstream of a setback dike, but that for anadromous adult passage, wanting the gaps between exclusionary devices to be more of 9 to 10 inches, and once you start to get to that spacing distance, beaver can move through those as well. So do want to just kind of point some of this out, that there's a lot of work going on right now as far as understanding how beavers interact with restoration sites and infrastructure. And I pulled this out of the King County Anticipating Beaver When Designing Restoration Projects manual recently released, highlighting the statement that if there is a culvert within your project site, you should assume beavers will eventually try to plug it. And knowing that we're building this near an existing dam, between two dams potentially, and in an area of heavy activity, we need to understand that the potential maintenance and other implications that go along with building a new structure near beavers. Chris Knudsen.
Yeah, I don't want to throw you off the topic, but I need a quick refresher here. So suppose we have a 150-foot dike breach in Belts Dike and no setback levee. Can you describe real briefly what the infrastructure impacts would be from that?
Yeah. So, this, as I said, we did look at that as kind of a point of comparison and understanding what a non, before applying a setback dike, what that would mean. So that's essentially raising up Sand Lake Road that would overtop, 11.6 is low point. There's a substantial portion of that road that would overtop at these higher tide levels. So what that would look like would be raising up Sand Lake Road and even Roma Ave, the approach to Sand Lake Road. And I have another couple of graphics. These are inundation extents of the 11-foot, 12-foot, and 13-foot water levels, which are essentially the high extremes that would occur today. And you can see that, inundates the eastern portion of the northernmost private property in Tierra del Mar. It inundates a substantial portion of Sand Lake Road there, and propagates, back into the East Marsh, where just starting to clip these other small properties, but certainly this kind of more natural private property has a lot of inundation, already ponded in a lot of cases. But this would essentially be that treatment where you are allowing those tides to occur, you're raising up the infrastructure to handle that. And not to very roughly paraphrase, the groundwater modeling work of the previous phase of work was that the groundwater would actually have either negligible difference or actually slightly lower groundwater levels, because the existing condition causes so much ponding and prolonged ponding of water. So the non-setback dike option would drain out a lot faster and could potentially lead to lower groundwater levels slightly. But these high tides would occur. And so this is what would be accepted, would be that, this portion of the property, private property, is impacted, the road is impacted. And what we're showing here would be the infrastructure improvements that would go along with an option like that, replacing the culvert on Sand Lake Road, showing a minimum 12-foot box culvert. And I know from working with Chris Lady that, we'd likely want to be looking at something bigger, but just to say that that's, minimum of what we would think would be required there to pass flows, and upsizing the culvert at Roma as well. Potentially raising this private property if that would facilitate that sort of option, while maintaining the drainage ditch. And, just kind of rendering graphic of kind of what we're talking about there would be a fairly long extent of Sand Lake Road getting raised up to 15 feet. And actually we looked at this as raising Sand Lake Road and Roma Ave as the setback dike with tide gates in place. Tide gates aren't really functional because of what I said before, like the storage volumes just aren't big enough to function as a setback dike. So this is essentially a non-setback dike option that raises infrastructure to accommodate that. Chris, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. But what's the argument against 4A and 4B versus alternative 1?
Well, I think the arguments for, and what I was saying before, as far as looking at all these different options, we're really targeted at reducing impact to the wetland by the footprint of the dike, as well as the area that would be cut off from full tidal reconnection. And, noting that from a drainage perspective, during these big storms, all of these would perform better than the existing condition, but it's undeniable that these other options and alternative 4 would allow higher tides to occur on a daily basis. The king tides would fully reach the south end of the marsh. And not only now with these kind of 12-foot tides, but with sea level rise projections ranging from 6 inches to 1.5 feet, into the future. What I've added here is a 14-foot contour. So when those 13-foot water levels are even pretty tightly contained on the on 2 properties within Tierra del Mar and potentially improving Sand Lake Road, the 14-foot contour projected sea level rise of another foot does start to reach a bit further, and it starts to clip a few more properties, and it's just more extensive. Those would be short duration peak tides, but nonetheless, there would be higher water levels occurring in the area that would be behind a setback dike otherwise. I think Malia had her hand raised before Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the bigger issue, even if we put in a bigger culvert and we raise Roma Avenue, anytime we have floodwaters coming up into that ditch is vital for draining half of Tierra del Mar. And when we had that ditch getting plugged with just vegetation, we had significant flooding that no longer occurs now that the ditch is cleaned out. So we cannot allow tide water to back up into that ditch.
Yeah, and you know, this is a part of the presentation I'm not probably going to get to, but looking at that particular culvert really being as a high target for replacement, just for drainage improvements in Tierra del Mar. And yeah, sorry, I'm actually not finding my particular slide I'm looking for. But yes, that lower culvert at Roma Ave would be subjected to those higher tides. You know, I do think that replacement of that culvert, oh, here we go, it's blocked. So, you know, this here, looking at not during a high tide, you know, the tide isn't hitting this culvert or impeding its capacity yet at this water level. And this would be about a, you know, kind of 11-foot water level. This culvert is undersized and it does impound water. So even just replacing this culvert with a bigger pipe, you know, right now it's only 12 inches. If you open that up with a 24 or 36-inch pipe, you would get a lot better drainage out of the Sand Lake Road ditch. Anyway, that may counteract, you know, influence of tide, but nonetheless, yeah, I think that's been the position and statement so far, is that we don't want to increase tide levels in Tierra del Mar, despite the conclusions of the previous study saying that, you know, it wouldn't affect groundwater negatively. But again, accepting that these higher brief peaks would occur, and determination that would not be acceptable.
So,
Chris,
just to be clear, can I jump in real quick? Just
Sure.
to follow up on that.
Mhm.
So just to be clear, there's still kind of some disagreement then in terms of what the effect of tide would be relative to Tierra del Mar.
You know, I don't know if there's disagreement per se. You know, I think it's a mixed story. You know, it's that, yes, a non-setback dike option exposes Sand Lake Road and Tierra del Mar to higher, more frequent, short duration peak tides. It's undeniable. You know, what the effect of those peak tides are on the infrastructure or on groundwater, you know, one of the concerns of the previous phase. You know, I think, and, you know, not to speak for others or kind of the decision that, you know, was made around the setback dike, but the goal of the setback dike is to limit those peak tides from occurring.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that, sorry, Chris, if that answers your question, or, you know, if you're,
I'm good.
Still have more nuance to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Chris Lady, definitely interested to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, so
if your hand was still up.
yeah, we'll go ahead and put that on the list to get the biggest pipe we can get in there. So the question that I have, though, if we raise that intersection by 2 to 3 feet, which is good, that gives us cover over that top of the pipe. We'll end up putting concrete over it to give it strength. Just on the south end of that, we've got the room to raise it. And I don't know how far down the road that you anticipate raising that. Perfect. What backflow do you end up anticipating? Is that raising that road going to, is it purely for upsizing the culvert, or is raising the road also performing some type of own little dam, because you don't take it all the way to the west? It only looks like you're taking it so far.
Yeah, and both both of these tie-in locations are hitting 15 feet. So what we were looking at 15-foot elevation as the top of a potential setback dike.
Okay.
And so we use that 15-foot elevation as a, potential raising of the road to get the infrastructure above these tide levels. So, kind of backing up where we've just let these tides occur, and you can see there's, it kind of gets clipped off here, but it starts to raise up. We're not missing much. So this is a few hundred feet of road that's impacted at, a little bit of the road hit by even the 11s start to interact with the roadway. I think this might be the cut of the culvert, but certainly 12s start to inundate the road. 13 starts to inundate the road. 15 is what we're showing here of the road raising up, carries all the way back to Pollock. And it would just be this eastern piece of Roma that's below 15. And so 15 is the target there. With a 12-foot box minimum, that would be big enough for the water rushing into the East Marsh. That would be adequate capacity to drain this area out rapidly. Yeah, so again, I think we wanted to present this as, really a starting point as, or, point of comparison and starting point for you first breach the dike, you apply this level of inundation, and then you start adding these setback dikes to block the tide levels and then balance that with capacity for storing the water. And yeah, let me know if there's still remaining questions. And there's other considerations logistically about tie-ins to the road, and Chris, definitely interested in some of your thoughts on some.
No, my biggest question is, by raising the road, do we impact the property owner on the north of Roma?
No, and not the property north of Roma here. So
that northwest corner is what specifically I was looking at.
Right. No, raising the road wouldn't impact this property, but it doesn't protect this property at all. I think that's, as we looked at, like, yes, you can raise Roma, the eastern end of Roma, and, potentially more critically raising Sand Lake Road, the area that truly overtops during those tides, but that does nothing to protect this, this corner of the private property. And raising the road wouldn't impact this property either, but it doesn't provide any protective value for this property.
So raising Roma 2 to 3 feet is really only intended to match the elevation of Sand Lake Road. It's the taper to match, not so much raising the road, but it's to match Sand Lake Road.
Yeah. And the Sand Lake Road raising, 2 to 3 feet. So we're talking about, 11.6 or just say 12 feet. So if we raised it 3.3 feet at the low point, that's the maximum raising of Sand Lake Road at the low point. As we get further back here, we're really just kind of tying it in, transitioning into existing grade. And so you can see with even the 13-foot inundation, the red, Roma is not below 13 feet. This piece is below 14 feet. So this is where, those extreme high tides in the future could start to impact Roma Ave. And this shows even more to raise Sand Lake Road and have, the same elevation of access for Roma Ave. You need to raise this approach of Roma Ave, but not much, like a foot. It wouldn't be that 2 to 3 feet. Sorry.
Thanks.
No.
Yeah, my question is kind of following up on Malia's comment earlier about if that culvert at Roma is backwatered, or if it's full of water from tidal inundation, how much does that impede outflow for water flowing down the Sand Lake ditch? And does that then make the Roma Avenue elevation function more as a dam that could backwater or could back up water into the area to the south of Roma Avenue?
Yeah. What this would look like would be, the bottom of this culvert is at about 12. So if we were to get that 12-foot water level, we would start to see the bottom of this culvert starting to get lapped by backwater. And, certainly with 13-foot water levels, we're not only blocking water from draining out of the culvert, but we're actually allowing tide water to propagate up the Roma Ave, or excuse me, the Sand Lake Road ditch upstream of Roma. If you upsize the culvert, you could conceivably make this culvert big enough and have enough headroom or clearance so that it wouldn't impede drain out of the Sand Lake Road ditch. But like I said, without any sort of tide gate on that, the high tide levels, 12-foot, 13-foot, do start to propagate back into the ditch. And that's you do start to see that in this inundation mapping here, where this 13-foot water level does get back into the ditch upstream of Roma. Does that answer your question, Noel? Yeah.
I think so. I guess I was thinking of the water being in that culvert as introducing some sort of resistivity, maybe in electronics terms, that would prevent the water from being able to flow through there fast enough, and maybe then water would back up behind Roma Avenue. But I think I'm hearing you say that if you increase the culvert size, or maybe even put it up higher in elevation, then you would no longer have any potential for that backwatering of a tide up to 13 feet. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's essentially what I'm saying, and that the existing small pipe, that's really what's impeding that drain out upstream of Roma Ave, and we see that in this 2017 storm photo, where just the small pipe is what's really backing things up. And yes, Noel, when if we got a 13-foot water level in the marsh that backwaters this culvert, during the moment when that water is up, it would impede flow coming out of the ditch and culvert. In fact, like I said, that water would be pushing upstream at that point. But that would be a very short duration. It would really only be at the very peak of that tide, and in contrast with the existing condition that when that high water level occurs in the marsh now, it takes a really long time to drain out. Whereas if this whole system were fully reconnected, you would get that short-term peak, and then it would drain out, within an hour. And then once it drains out, then everything, drains out very rapidly. Limited, of course, by the beaver dams and things like that. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I mean, I think right now the really limiting factor of capacity here is the size of the existing pipe. Yeah. Leah?
Thanks. Hunter, do you mind, I think going forward a slide or two with the inundation mapping with maybe you had some fill or something, this one, I guess my first question is that inundation extent. So none of that is inundating right now with current condition.
It is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's okay.
So, right. Good point. And, I think the difference too is the timing of inundation. Sorry, let me go back a few more. So, this is our extreme event. And of course, again, like a lot of what we're analyzing is the really extreme case. When we look more at 10-foot tides and 2-year flows, peak tides or peak water levels occurring now, this dark blue line, they are limited. They're only getting up to, roughly 10. Sorry, I've got missing a decimal here. So this would be 9.5 and this should be 10. So we're seeing those 10-foot tide levels under existing conditions. It is limited, but then under the 100-year storm, once we're flowing all of this water into the existing marsh, the water level can, under this extreme condition, get up to 12. That would lead to those same inundation extents. And, again, under this extreme event, not only did we get that 12-foot water level, but we stayed above 11 feet for, 2 days. And then it took another 2 days to drain down to 10. So it is this prolonged effect and these high water levels that can already occur during major storm events, coupled with king tides. And then, under the proposed conditions with these different setback alternatives, and the highest ones are again the non-setback dike alternative, you get those same peaks roughly, but then it drains out really fast.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess in full transparency, from like restoring the maximum area of the marsh possible, I would love to see the starting point being that, you know, just protecting infrastructure with no setback dike or just raising the road. Do you see, and you kind of mentioned that like the tie gate on the culvert ditch. So is there a combination you think of raising the road and that the ditch culvert improvements and all of that could be protective of infrastructure so that we don't need any setback dike in the marsh proper? Or is that like is there a combination of actions that could get us there, you think? Or you are like with all those pieces are still just yeah, I'm sorry, there's so many little pieces, but that's I guess where I'm coming from. Like I like the road only protection option if that's viable, but I can't tell if we think that is a viable route to keep looking at.
You know, that's a tough question to answer, and I think yes, you can see the differences in how it performs during a storm, and that's maybe the main point of how a non-setback dike alternative would function, is that you do get these peak tides, and you get them every time there is a high tide. You're going to see that high tide at the south end of the marsh, and so whether or not that's acceptable, I guess is not necessarily for me to answer, but just to say that the existing setback dike does limit those peak tides on a daily basis. And so if the baseline for performance is that it needs to perform as good or better than the existing dike does, then there's no hiding that we would be seeing these higher peak water levels, short duration water levels.
Right. And I guess I just mean like, it looked like you had some other ideas about like, protecting the private property with raising some of their land, or, I was curious if there's like other things we can do that aren't a setback dike to help protect the infrastructure so that we're not forced to, so we could not have the setback dike option. And that's, but I didn't know if there was any other pieces to that we could consider. Or just want to put that in folks' heads that's I would like that to be a thought, to not leave alternative 4 behind yet and think about what other creative solutions we could have to protect private infrastructure from tide peaks. Because I think not having a setback dike through the bottom of the marsh would be the desired kind of marsh restoration alternative, focused objective,
Certainly is a balance between the infrastructure protection, the private property protection, and what would be a full restoration, or more natural restoration. And I think too, just the additional point being that these high water levels, 13 foot is conceivable to happen now, and with sea level rise potential another foot, or there's a range of projections, of course, but it's not only how this system would perform now, but how it would perform in 50 years. So, I guess I want to be aware of that dynamic, that is the discussion here, and that is the decision to be made or to be reinforced. And I'm providing the information of how these different configurations would perform, but certainly is a complicated question of what is acceptable as far as these tide levels go. Malia or Cami, I'm not sure who was first.
I just have a real quick question. On your existing modeling for the 100-year flood hiking tide modeling scenario, is that with the current dike, with the tide gate fully not functioning?
Actually because we didn't get enough data in the most recent data collection of 2023, 2022, 2023 that had a substantial storm event. We used the 2017 water level data, a much longer period that had more storms and was a better data set to use for the modeling. So the modeling has been based on 2017 data that has been ramped up to create these larger events. So, you know, I maybe the distinction I was making before about how does 2017 function differently than it does today with the missing tide gate is that, you know, we get 1/2 a foot higher water levels under existing conditions, but that really doesn't matter when we talk about the 100-year storm. There's really no difference there. The peak water levels are driven by storage and fresh water coming in. But during, you know, what I'm calling the first storm or these smaller events, yeah, this is actually more of a typical winter condition. What we're showing here for the existing setback dike performance, this was 2017, and so now with the missing tide gate, we would see the dark blue line would be getting about 1/2 a foot higher. Not significantly different, and again, only really important when there's not a big storm taking place. So I'm confident in the choice to have used the 2017 data specifically for the storm event modeling. Does that answer your question, Malia?
Yeah, you answered my question. I was just curious as to what your modeling was based on. I just need to know it was the 2017 water level data. Thanks.
Yeah, and again, for, you know, this is kind of 2017 data, pure data of tide levels and water levels observed in the marsh, and the model calibrated to those water levels. But then when we developed the extreme events, we did a lot more as far as scaling flows and, you know, applying precipitation to generate the extreme events. So it's synthetic data for the extreme events. Cami.
Great. I was just going to emphasize Leah's point. Could you go to the I guess it's a couple slides before this where you have the, okay, that's fine. You also have one with the so just to broaden that discussion on the setback levy, oftentimes when those are constructed, especially because of all the things you've already listed off, Hunter, with maintaining those and what to set the level at and ongoing subsidence behind the dike, you know, chasing the elevations of what's going to drain the area you built the setback dike to protect, and then, you know, just the other factors that start to play in. The maintenance is significant, and the so I want to emphasize the king tides. Yes, you said that water level would be significant during those big events, but I want to emphasize the short duration of that water as opposed to when you build a setback dike, and if you're running into issues with either the level of the tide gate or the subsidence of the ground or beavers or you know, issues with that maintenance of that drainage structure within the setback levee. So the alternative to raise or do other protections for that private land to offset chasing those long-term costs and even potential to hold water like a bathtub behind your setback levee, which of course you want to avoid to protect the private properties to begin with. So I just wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, and, you know, Cami, to kind of drive some of that home as well, you know, talking with the folks up here managing this tide gate at Smuggler's Slough, they've had issues where, you know, where the beavers blocked the tide gate to stay closed. So the tide gate was closed for a while. They couldn't get it open, and they had to, you know, exhume it basically, you know, dig it back out, get it to open, and now the tide gate doesn't close properly. So they, you know, are getting this flushing of flows through the tide gate that, you know, they intended to have close at certain times, but now the tide gate doesn't close effectively. So there are these, you know, differences between, you know, the idealized model where we're showing this culvert with full capacity. It closes perfectly, it opens perfectly, it drains out, it's got full capacity to drain out. But to maintain it to function that way well into the future, there will be work required. You know, there's effort in the maintenance. There's potential that it does get plugged. And if it does get plugged, what are not only the maintenance implications, but the potential, drainage and flooding implications of a system that's been put in that either doesn't get maintained properly, or it's hard to keep up with. Of course, the beavers are working all the time, and so there certainly are those maintenance implications and potential lack of function or reduced function under those conditions.
And the construction of those, the elevations and the way those are set, it's a somewhat static solution to a dynamic changing problem. So that can be, that can be just an ongoing issue in and of itself. So
yeah, it is complex, and there's more details as far as again, like exactly where is it relative to the dam, and are there ways, like I'm thinking more and more, if we have a setback dike in this location, I think it makes sense to put it downstream of the beaver dam and essentially let the beavers maintain their dam where it is and maintain this southern 10 acres roughly as beaver pond and freshwater marsh. And if you kind of leave all of that intact, maybe they're less likely to want to dam more and plug the culvert, plug the tide gate system.
Yeah,
maybe.
They're greedy and unpredictable, and I love them and want them to stay wherever we can keep them. But that said, that unpredictability, I like the idea, if this has to happen and the setback levy is necessary to protect the private land. I like the idea of it being offset from the existing beaver structure. We've done a number of these things and dealt with various challenges with beavers, and it's in most cases it's very doable and manageable. This is an interesting situation in that it's going to be an attractive nuisance that they will likely zero in on because it may then benefit them in the long run. So it's just a really difficult thing to try to predict. But the idea, I hope that the idea of not having to have a setback levy is really fully being pursued and discussed openly. I know sometimes those conversations can be just so difficult to have, but sometimes in the long run, with the best of intentions, you look back and with the hindsight and wish you'd maybe pushed a little harder or thought a little more creatively about a solution, because you end up heading down a path that just becomes almost unmanageable. So it just that's all.
Yeah, and there's a lot more kind of details of logistics of tie-ins and geotechnical conditions and managing settlement, phased construction to manage that settlement, how much over excavation and subgrade work would be needed to build a dike in this location, first of all.
Because you're building on peat marsh, you're building on peat marsh. So, we've seen these sink, you know what it's like to have equipment out in these sites. I mean, you're building it on pudding basically. And, it just can be very challenging. And then how much are you impacting that wetland surface to construct the setback levy? And then is it going to be maintainable and sustainable and provide ultimately what you constructed it to provide?
Mm-hmm. And this would be the tie-in location roughly on the west side, tying into this forested dune over there. This is Malia actually in the center of the photo. What are we cutting through, I guess, is another question to evaluate and answer here of, what are the plant communities, or, what's the impact to the marsh? What are some of these areas, Noel, referencing some of your previous vegetation mapping and predictions. A lot of the marsh is in really good condition as far as vegetation goes. There are, particularly this pocket over here that has some reed canary grass in it and is maybe less pristine or, in less of a good condition. But, that's another topic of what are you filling over? We're talking about an 80 foot, 80 to 100 foot wide berm. Yeah, so I think that certainly is what needs to be decided is, yeah, are these various impacts acceptable? And then is the long-term maintenance needed to keep the system functioning also, acceptable and going to happen? Sorry, no, there's a couple more hands up. Jason?
Yeah, I just had a couple clarifying questions. One, I'm definitely not an MTR expert, and with that possibly being on OPRD property, is that something that is usually like the owning entity usually hires an outside firm or company to do long-term maintenance or even operation of that, or does it kind of fall on the owning agency and then just relying on expertise from contractors or whatnot for larger maintenance items and stuff?
Yeah, the kind of long-term maintenance as far as keeping things clear and clean and kind of regular monitoring and yeah, more of the clearing blockages, that sort of thing, that certainly would be on the landowner where the structure is. As far as the repair or replacement of the mechanical components or the tide gates, that certainly would be the specialist contractor. And the Mutatato regulator specifically is invented, patented, and typically installed by Nehalem Marine Manufacturing. And long-term maintenance reportedly is quite low when things are functioning well. But just hearing about the Smuggler Slough tide gate system on the Lummi Nation that is kind of similar to this in that it's set very high. It's set to mostly stay open and only close when the highest tides are reached. It's in the location of beaver activity, and it has had siltation issues and beaver clogging and stuff like that. And it's them, it's the Lummi Nation, the tribe, maintaining that work. They've described when they have had to do the major dig out, they had to fully isolate it and build a cofferdam and, re-isolate that structure in order to, take an excavator out there and scoop the mud away, and then brought a Vactor truck, vacuum truck out to suck this mud off of this structure and, try to clean up the structure without damaging it, with a, heavy-handed excavator. You can imagine an excavator plucking material away has a potential to damage some of this equipment as well. So, yes, I think that, that's a reality of putting a setback dike and new tide gate structure in this location is, understanding the likely maintenance that's going to be involved. And yeah, being on park property, that would be a park responsibility. Whether it was you all directly or parks hiring a contractor to handle it. But
yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Very helpful. And then also with the requirement, I was under the impression, I guess, that if the the main dike was breached or removed, whatever alteration took place, that there was the requirement of a setback dike. Is that not the case, that it's actually a requirement?
Well, it's I guess a decision to be made, and yeah, not a firm requirement of anybody's other than just discussions and essentially agreements that have been made, decisions that have been made, and coordination that's taken place with Tierra Del Mar property owners and community group of kind of setting that expectation.
As long as it's ensured that the groundwater infiltration or rising in the community will not occur, then the setback dike doesn't necessarily have to be implemented.
Well, again, it's acknowledging the difference in how the system would behave, whether there is a setback dike or not. And like I said, it's kind of that mixed story that you know, yeah, everything performs better than the existing condition during these big storms, but on a daily basis, no setback dike would allow higher tides to reach Sand Lake Road and Tierra del Mar.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not a clear cut
Right.
answer. You know, it's at different times, how would this system perform differently under you know, purely tidal conditions versus during the storms. And you know, we're evaluating both here.
Okay. Thank you.
But, and you know, I don't know, I guess as we, you know, left the previous stage of the project and the, you know, extensive tech team meetings and stakeholder engagement that occurred, you know, that was the decision that was made out of the last phase of work, was that the dike breach with a setback dike was the preferred alternative to be investigated more. And, you know, at this point, you know, the decision essentially was made that there will be a setback dike, and we're looking to refine, you know, the details of a setback dike. And, you know, I think a lot of what I've talked about here today, as far as some of the constraints or challenges of building a dike there or maintaining a tide gate there, you know, all of those aren't to say that, you know, a setback dike alternative isn't the right thing to do here because of all the other factors and decisions that have been made. But I do want to be clear that, you know, the setback dike also has its downsides of course, the impacts associated with it, but the logistics of building it and of maintaining it in the future. Like this is a complicated discussion, and it's not a clear-cut, perfect solution answer. Each one has drawbacks, and I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah, helpful though.
Malia?
Yeah, I'm just trying to sit here and brainstorm on things. But first, I'd like to respond. Leah had put a comment in about possibly talking to the landowners to see if they would be willing to take injury on their property being, you know, infrequently flooded. I think that's an option we should consider and follow through. And now that we know, the other thing is, since I'm brainstorming here, is now that we know that we only need to breach the dike 100 feet, and the biggest issue to Tierra del Mar is this 100-year peak combination storm. Is there a way that, I guess my question is how many muted tide gates would we need to put in across the existing dike to give us our 100-foot opening, where the tide gates would be set so that they only closed when we have or are approaching the 11-foot mark? So basically, this would be a way of breaching the dike, essentially allowing it to be opened and functioning, you know, almost all the time as an open estuary. But then there would be the safeguard of the muted tide gates closing at the higher elevation. And I'm thinking if we're setting up at the existing dike, then we're far enough away from the beaver activity and keeping it open that the beavers will probably be more encouraged to stay at the south end and stay away from this north end, thereby, you know, reducing tide gate maintenance and fighting beavers. It's just a thought.
Yeah, and so I guess that, you know, similar to the alternative that was investigated in the previous phase of replacing the existing tide gate with a new tide gate, a modern tide gate system. And, you know, yeah, I guess there's, you know, rehashing of previous decisions kind of taking place here. But, you know, I think that there were a number of reasons why the kind of new tide gate option wasn't selected as the preferred alternative. You know, one of them being that the existing dike itself would need a lot of work, and that the size of a new tide gate structure, in order, to provide this kind of equivalent connectivity, is also quite large and very expensive, and not necessarily more expensive than the full removal and boardwalk option, but you would have to get a new tide gate structure to be very large to provide an equivalent level of connectivity and moderated velocities. We haven't reevaluated anything from a modern tide gate replacement standpoint in this phase, but I think that's what you're asking about, right? Is essentially looking at that previous alternative of the modern tide gate replacement.
Well, not so much, because I think we were looking at it a smaller tide gate system. I'm talking about one that would span 100 feet.
Yeah. I mean, and again, it's a very, very substantial structure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of analysis to go along with that, and cost estimating and so forth. I guess I'm not necessarily dismissing that in any way, but just to say that that option was not pursued in the previous stage.
A couple of the reasons for that were also that the existing dike is not very tall. Its low point is only 12 feet and change in a couple of spots, and it's not built to the modern standards for width and grade for
Side slopes and
yeah. So the amount of work that would be required on the existing dike, I mean, I'm just guessing here, but because of its length, it might be a lot more material being placed in the wetland to bring it up to standard than to create the shorter setback dike. But between the cost and complication of the array of muted tidal regulators that would be needed, the need to overbuild the existing dike, that's a great profile picture there. It just all together, it didn't seem like a great option, but that doesn't mean it can't be revisited.
Yeah, and what Noel's pointing out, that's shown on this graphic here, the orange prism in the middle, this is a cross section of a potential setback dike. The orange prism is representing the existing dike side slopes and low point, and what's being proposed as a setback dike that has flatter, more stable side slopes for longevity, long-term stability, as well as the additional height that we're talking about for a setback dike to not only protect against the peak tides that occur now, but have freeboard under those events and to accept higher water levels in the future. Essentially taking this cross section and applying it to the existing setback or the existing dike, as Noel's getting at, would be a ton of additional reconstruction of the existing dike to flatter side slopes. And you can see like the width of the existing dike is more on the order of 30 to 40 feet with these steep side slopes that it has. And in order to bring this dike up to modern standards for stability, we would be expanding the footprint of the existing dike as well. Which that does go along with the concept of just maintaining that dike as the trail in the future, is either accepting that there are some areas that would need to be raised up, there may be some areas that need to be stabilized on the outer slopes, but without some sort of full reconstruction of the existing dike to maintain it as the trail, it also has some vulnerabilities and potential repairs that would be needed.
Now, I realize that the existing dike has some vulnerabilities and possibly needs some repairs. I was just thinking, since it looks like it would be a very practical way to maintain a trail system, I'm just trying to brainstorm and figure out maybe there's a way of doing a combination of things. And I'm not convinced that we have to completely go out and rebuild anything to the specs of our alternate dike system. But that's my non-engineering perspective. It's just something that I was trying to, bring up is, get us away from the beavers, give them, let me put it this way. Here's what I see from an environmental perspective. I see the beavers as being our best friends for creating the maximum fish habitat and the varying salinities of water that we're going to need out here. And I'm just trying to also protect Tierra del Mar. And I have a feeling that the owners of the land in Tierra del Mar are going to come back and say, I really don't want to be impacted more frequently by these tide floods. And is there a way that we can find a balance to avoid doing one of these alternative dikes, which seems to be more damaging to everything that's going on back there? And I'm just trying to figure out a way to make the system function and evolve the way it wants to, and with the least amount of impact.
Hunter, can you speak to the requirement to upgrade the structure, the profile of the dike? I think that came from modern FEMA standards. Wasn't that the case? And would FEMA standards apply in this situation?
Yeah, it's really more of, modern geotechnical design and less than FEMA. I guess I would be leaning more on Army Corps standards for levee construction. And so, the flatter side slopes, 3-to-1 side slopes are more typical or acceptable under modern design criteria. And, you see some locations, the location of the existing culvert is one of the worst, where we have seen a lot of erosion and very steep banks. And, even on the inside where, the scour, the eddy, the scour that's taking place there is really narrowing this dike. Not only that, but, our geotech was just out there recently too, and pointing out, some of the trees that are on the dike that have a lean to them, have the potential to fall over and create a pretty big hole. So I guess just to say that, modern levee design guidelines are conservative, and rightly so. But yes, modern levee design criteria do have flatter side slopes, more, seepage analysis and freeboard requirements. And, there's a lot that goes into it, and the existing dike in its current state would be deficient from a number of perspectives, from, long-term stability for side slopes, height and freeboard under peak water levels. And, the existing dike is performed well for that amount of time, but it is starting to show some wear, and to bring it up to modern standards would be, fairly significant reworking. And, to Malia's point that maybe it's not absolutely critical to do that, I think that's potentially true, but there's more risk associated with, leaving the dike in its current state, or kind of patch repair here and there. Those kind of Band-Aid actions or less extensive, bringing it up to modern criteria is just increasing the risk associated with potential failure.
But I'm talking about, forget where the current tide gate is. I mean, it's horrible.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about going back to where we're actually talking about breaching the dike 100 foot there.
Mm-hmm.
and coming in and putting, I don't know, maybe it would take a series of 3 tide gates. I don't know how many tide gates does it take to span 100 foot there where the main channel is, so that we've got that opening. And then we just have the ability on rare occasions to close them. So they wouldn't be opening and closing all the time. And yeah, if necessary, would have to upgrade. I mean, I'm accepting that we're going to have to upgrade at least part of this tide gate to some extent. Or I mean, not tide gate, but the dike.
Yeah. Well, just for reference, the typical tide gate doors are about 10 feet wide. They do make larger ones, and but my understanding is that the most widely used and reliable version is about a 10-foot wide, and so an equivalent span width would essentially be 10 gates. 10 gates wide, and that to kind of bring it back to cost, not that we're talking about a lot of expensive things here, but tide gates of that sort of scale, I don't know of any, but some that are maybe half that size or a third of that size, we're talking about a $3 million structure probably, and for something that size, 10 gates of that scale, I mean, I'm totally guessing at this point, but $5 million structure, something like that.
Thanks.
With its own
that
level
helps.
of maintenance, and again, with the rest of the dike, I'm kind of thinking on the fly here as far as throwing numbers out, but I think that would have to be looked into more to come up with really what would be required from a dike reconstruction standpoint. And we did look at tide gate sizing in the earlier stage, but we were really focused on how big would be big enough for fish passage, and enough capacity to convey outflows during the big storms. I think we probably need bigger than what we were looking at in the previous phase, but yeah, again, it's kind of going back to something that we looked at before and had been decided against. Yeah, and so I guess just to acknowledge that we're at our 3-hour mark. We've had a lot of great conversation, and obviously this is a complicated site, and a lot of kind of challenging factors and trade-offs to decide on here and to balance. So I don't know if there's how we're doing on time as far as folks needing to cut off here, move on to different things, and if we need to have additional discussion really on some of these topics, if there's other things we need to be looking into, and yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll jump in at this point. I do think that there are future meetings on this account. This is a shared TEP Zoom account, and I would hate for us to get kicked off if another meeting starts. So I think we should end it here. I will encourage everybody to, write up any comments or questions that they have and send them to me, and, we can have further discussions on the topic. My email is conrad@tbnep.org. And I can, compile all questions and comments. The next steps, there's going to be a town hall meeting at the Kiawanda Community Center on June 17th at 1 p.m. That'll also be a Zoom meeting as well for anybody that is interested in hearing that. You can either attend in person or on Zoom. It's open to anybody. And then that'll also be recorded and posted online. After that meeting happens and we get the public comments, public feedback, we can compile everything from this meeting and that meeting, and have some internal discussion with parks, and they're going to have to obviously take all of this information into account. And then I would imagine we'll have another tech team meeting towards the end of the summer, after all this information's been compiled. But yeah, if anybody has any last statements, we maybe have another minute or two, but we should probably get off, and I'd hate for this to end abruptly if this meeting were to end because another meeting starts.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you everybody for your time and listening through and providing great thoughtful input. As I said, this is complicated, and there's a lot of information I was trying to cover here. So thanks for sticking with it.
Thank you, Hunter. It was great.
See you guys.
Yep. Thanks, Hunter. Thanks, everybody. Good seeing you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Let me stop.